Tales for Dark Nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
40 years with the same company. That's a long time. Robert Harris shrugged as he pushed the soggy salad around the paper plate with a flimsy plastic fork. He looked at the young intern sitting across from him. Time goes fast, Thomas. It didn't feel like 40 years. Aren't they supposed to do more than, let's face it, a crappy lunch? Robert put the fork down. That's what happens when a family company sells to a private equity firm. Get used to being under a cost-cutting edict. With a grim smile, he passed his hand over his plate. This is my reward for being a loyal employee. I was told they made an exception for me. Really? Why? I'm the last original employee on the last day of his career. The younger man nodded. I like it here. Think they'll offer me a job after I graduate? Robert stood. Pray they don't. It used to be a rewarding place to work. Not anymore. Besides, they'll sell it in a few years and everything will change again. He dropped the barely touched plate of food into a nearby waste bin and headed toward the cafeteria exit. As he got there, his new boss entered the cafeteria and smiled. Last day, huh? Robert nodded. The man, half his age with an MBA from Yale, put a hand on Robert's shoulder. Sorry I was late, just got out of a meeting. Did you enjoy the meal? Yes, thank you. Good. Why don't you go ahead and pack your office? You can leave early since we need access to it. He smiled as he looked Robert in the eye. The individual taking over your responsibilities will be here Monday. She's asked for it to be remodeled. He turned and walked away, not offering to shake Robert's hand or say have a nice life. Robert shook his head as he rolled his eyes. Continuing on to the elevators, he would take the ride to the 6th floor for the last time. In his office, he sent emails to his customers, thanking them for their support over the years and reminding them he would retire at the end of the day. His last piece of business was to place the few remaining personal items into a white storage box. Pictures of his son and daughter, the grandkids, an autographed baseball signed by Johnny Bench, and a small desk clock won 25 years ago in an inter-office sales contest. He picked up the picture of his wife, Peggy. Before placing it in the box, he stared at her image. A tear formed in the corner of his eye and rolled down his cheek. The memory of that horrible Christmas day 2 years ago flooded back. I sure love having the kids visit, Peggy said as she dried a saucepan he had just washed. But it's also nice when they leave. He started to agree with her, but she stumbled, dropped the pan, and grabbed his shoulder for support. What's wrong, Peg? I don't know. She blinked several times. I'm dizzy. I've got a blinding headache. Robert steadied her and led her to the bedroom. Why don't you lie down? I'll get you a couple of Tylenols and some water. You're so sweet. Thank you. She looked up. I love you, Bobby. I love you too. He bent down and kissed her. He hurried to the kitchen for the water and pills. He returned to the bedroom, placed the glass on the nightstand, and sat next to her on the edge of the bed. Her eyes were closed. He nudged her on the shoulder and said, Peg, honey, I have your Tylenol. She was unresponsive. He glanced at the digital clock as he called 911 on his cell phone at exactly 10:05 p.m. Those words had been their last. He sighed and placed the picture in the box, swallowing hard to clear the lump in his throat. At 2:30 in the afternoon, Harry Benson, head of loss prevention, stepped into his office. Hi, Bob. You ready? Robert shut off the computer screen, grabbed his suit jacket off the coat rack, picked up the box, and started to walk out of his office for the last time. Sorry, Bob. I have to search the box. Gotta make sure you're not stealing paper clips, he said with a big smile. How much longer are you staying, Harry? End of the year. HR already talked to me. Remember, you and I are the same age. That's right. Harry was a retired police officer and the only person left in the company Robert considered a friend. Their friendship started several years ago after a company newsletter announced they shared the same birthday. Walking to the elevator, Harry asked, Got any plans for your retirement? Shaking his head, Robert sighed. No, not really. I haven't thought much about it since Peggy passed away. She and I had a lot of plans, but now... While waiting for the elevator, Harry was silent. Finally, as the door opened, he said, Sorry, being forced to retire sucks. I didn't mean to remind you. Robert shrugged. That's okay. It's just the way it is. Both were quiet until they reached the building's entrance. Harry reached to shake his friend's hand. Good luck to you, Bob. One last duty. I have to take your security badge. After ending the shake, with a grim smile, he held his palm open. Call me sometime. Let's go fishing or something. As he placed the card in Harry's hand, he said, I'll do that, although he knew he never would. Are you sure you're going to be okay, Daddy? The house felt less empty with the kids around. He hated how fast the weekend passed. Robert hugged his daughter tightly. Susan, I'll be fine. I'm meeting a few friends in the morning for coffee. He broke the embrace, held her by her shoulders, and smiled. Like I told you last night at dinner, it's going to take a few days to get used to being retired. Lying to his daughter did not come easy, but he didn't want her to worry. She was the mirror image of her mother. Petite, slender, long dark blonde hair, and she possessed the same angelic face. He knew she had her own life to live, and he did not want to burden her with his feelings. It was Sunday afternoon, and his son-in-law, Erik, gathered their kids for the trip home to Kansas City. As he and his daughter walked to her car, Robert put his arm around her shoulder. Thanks for spending the weekend. I've really enjoyed having all of you here. Daddy, she paused for a moment, why don't you think about moving to Kansas City? You'd be closer, and I wouldn't worry about you so much. He smiled. What would I do in Kansas City besides getting your way? You and Erik both have jobs, the kids are in school, and we'd see each other less than we do now. No, Susan, I think it's best I stay here. She smiled and squeezed his hand. Think about it. He nodded. Okay, I'll think about it. As they backed out of the driveway, he waved. Not quite ready to go back inside the now empty house, Robert decided to take a walk around the neighborhood. Afterward, he would watch 60 Minutes. An infomercial for a glorified crockpot woke him at 2:13 a.m. Confused, Robert wondered why Peggy had not gotten him up by now. He had to be at work in a few hours. Realization of why he was still in front of the TV caused him to stare at the ceiling. A tear involuntarily trickled down his cheek. After a few moments, he slowly pushed himself up, turned the TV off, and headed for his bedroom. The lamp on Peggy's bedroom nightstand was on. That's strange. I guess Susan turned it on. He switched it off and continued into the bathroom to get ready for bed. He passed through the master bathroom and opened the door to their closet. A cold pocket of air hung there, causing him to shiver. Thinking the furnace register might be closed, he checked. It was open. With a shrug, he undressed and slipped on a t-shirt and lounge pants. Her clothes still hung on her side of the closet. He didn't need the room, nor did he want to pack them away. He noticed a gap on her side, exposing her favorite nightgown. He touched the soft fabric, then drew the garment to his face and inhaled deeply. Memories of the intimacies shared with Peggy while she wore it made him smile. He assumed Susan had been in the closet earlier in the day. He left the gap and went to bed, ignoring the urge to take the gown with him. Coffee with his friends lasted most of Monday morning. The conversations were lively and he enjoyed the companionship. By 11, most of the guys had paid their bills and left the small diner. Only Dave Cooper remained. He had been Robert's counterpart for the West Coast for decades before the buyout. "How'd last Friday go?" Robert shrugged. "Okay, lunch sucked. I packed my stuff and Harry escorted me out of the building. End of story." Dave laughed. "Sounds like my last day. Only I didn't get a lunch." "You didn't miss anything." "After I retired, I felt like you do right now. What the hell am I going to do?" He put his hand on Robert's shoulder. "Relax, Bob. It'll take a few weeks. You'll get used to not going to work. I was miserable at first, but gradually I found other things to do. Give it time. You'll be fine." Robert looked at his friend. "If you say so. Why don't you join our Wednesday golf group? It's a great way to kill a morning." "I haven't played golf since Peggy." He paused. "I haven't played for a while." He stared at his friend for a few moments. "I'll be rusty." Laughing, Dave said, "No problem. None of us are any good. It's more of a social gathering than a golf game." He stood to leave. "One last thing. Joyce wants you to come to dinner Friday night. She has a friend she wants you to meet. No pressure, just a friendly dinner. Can you make it?" Robert was quiet. He didn't want to betray Peggy by dating. He hesitated. "I'm not sure about that right now. Who would want to meet a 66-year-old widower?" "A 66-year-old widow?" Dave said straight-faced. "I'll think about it." Robert returned home late Friday night. Thoughts of canceling had occurred to him all week, but finally he decided to go. As it had been when Peggy was alive, dinner with Dave and Joyce provided laughter and good conversation. Jolene was nice, but every time he looked at her, he saw Peggy smile or heard her laughter. It was unnerving. He helped the Coopers clean up after Jolene left. While putting dishes away, Robert said, "Was it my imagination or did Jolene laugh like Peggy?" Dave chuckled. "Your imagination, Bob. She sounded nothing like Peggy." Shaking his head, Robert finished helping, thanked them for an enjoyable evening, and said goodnight. Just before entering the house, he touched the button to lower the garage door. When he walked into the kitchen, a chill ran up his spine. Every single accent light in the kitchen, dining room, and living room were on. Peggy loved the ambiance they added to their house, but he had not turned them on since her funeral. Frowning, he knew for sure he was not responsible. Standing in the center of the dining room, memories of the lights made him take a deep breath. He had forgotten how warm and inviting they made their home. As he slowly let his breath out, he remembered the cleaning service had been there earlier in the day. Reaching to turn one off, he stopped. A cabinet door was open, one he had not opened in 2 years. Without hesitation, he walked into the kitchen to close it. After stepping on something hard and brittle, he glanced down and saw the remains of a wine glass shattered on the floor. He looked up at the cabinet and saw its twin precariously perched on the edge of a shelf, ready to fall. He stiffened, stared at the glass, and realized it was one of 2 he had bought for Peggy on their 25th wedding anniversary. After sweeping up the broken glass, he looked again at the lights. They filled him with wonderful memories of Peggy. He left them on. The first thing he noticed as he walked into the bedroom was Peggy's nightstand lamp on again. Before leaving for the Coopers, he had made sure it was off. He stared at it for a few moments, then turned and walked down the hall to the guest bedroom. If his daughter had made a surprise visit, why had she not called first? Plus, the question of why she would not clean up the broken glass filled him with a sense of foreboding. When he opened the door, the room was dark and empty. His stomach clenched as he felt the hairs on the back of his neck tingle. After several moments of uncertainty, he hurried to his bathroom. His image in the mirror startled him. A gaunt face with dark circles under the eyes stared back at him. He ran a trembling hand through increasing grayer hair. He sighed, leaned forward, placed his palms flat on the bathroom vanity, and lowered his head. His eyes closed as he shook his head slowly. When he straightened, he noticed something white on the floor of the closet. He turned and froze. It was Peggy's nightgown. Sleep eluded him the rest of the night. Each time the furnace kicked on or a car drove by, he woke up. Afterward, it would take forever to get back to sleep. Finally, during the early light of dawn, he gave up and went to the kitchen to make coffee. As it brewed, he took 2 cups down from the cabinet, put Sweet and Low in his, and a little bit of creamer in Peggy's. As he put the creamer up, he stopped. "What the heck are you doing, Robert? Losing your mind?" Closing his eyes tight to keep the tears from flowing, he took a deep breath and sighed. Finally, he emptied the cup with creamer, rinsed it, and placed it back in the cabinet. A month went by without another fallen nightgown and lights-on incidents. Eventually, Robert developed a routine which helped add structure to his life. Most days were dull and boring. He spent his time cleaning the garage, raking leaves, winterizing the house, and playing golf on Wednesday. He enjoyed the group of guys he played with and found himself looking forward to the weekly event. Concentrating on remembering which lights were on when he left the house, he realized all of the prior incidents were his fault. 3 weeks later, Robert was shopping at the small grocery store Peggy and he always used. The manager walked up to him and said, "How's retirement going, Bob?" "Boring." "Would you like something to do 3 or 4 days a week?" Robert smiled. "I would love something to do 6 or 7 days a week. Why do you ask?" "Well, I like to hire a retired gentleman to help sack and carry out groceries. I have an opening and thought if you're interested, you'd be perfect." "Yeah, I'm interested. When could I start?" A week later, Robert began working from 3 in the afternoon to 8 at night Tuesdays and Thursdays, and 11 in the morning to 4 in the afternoon on Saturdays and Sundays. He loved it. There was no pressure. He got to interact with people. He made a little extra money, and Wednesdays were free for golf. One Sunday night, after working till 6 in the evening, he didn't feel like fixing dinner. On the way home, he stopped for takeout. As he was getting a plate down, he felt a cool breeze pass him and heard a faint whisper. "Bobby." He spun around. The kitchen was empty. Only one person called him Bobby. Shaking his head, he tried to decide if he had imagined the voice. Unsure, he took his plate of food to the living room and picked at it while he watched TV. The next thing he knew, he felt a hand on his shoulder gently shaking him. "Time for bed, Bobby. You fell asleep." As was his habit, he said, "Just a minute, dear. I'll be right there." He froze. The touch on his shoulder had been real, and the voice Peggy's. He stared at her empty lounge chair next to his. With a trembling hand, he wiped a tear from his eye, stood up, turned off the TV, and went to bed. The weather turned cold and rainy on the Wednesday following his trip to Kansas City for Thanksgiving. With the golf game canceled, he spent the day reading and sorting through his DVD collection. After dozing in his chair several times, he went to bed before the local 10 o'clock news. At 1:35 a.m., he awoke to the sound of gentle snoring beside him. Half asleep, he smiled and rolled over to put his hand on Peggy's shoulder, just as he had for 40 years. His hand touched nothing. He sat up straight and turned on the nightstand lamp. He stared at Peggy's side of the bed. Empty. Fully awake, he got out of bed and headed to the bathroom. As soon as he walked into the room, his foot stepped on something soft and slippery. Flipping on the lights, he looked down. A chill traveled up his spine. His foot was standing on Peggy's nightgown. The days leading up to Christmas were busy. He worked at the grocery store as much as possible and volunteered at a food bank. His days were full, and getting home after dark was not unusual. One night while driving through the neighborhood, he noticed how bright and cheerful the Christmas lights were on the houses he passed. He smiled, thinking of Peggy telling him to put the lights wherever he wanted, then changing everything until she was completely satisfied. Once completed, the house would always be beautiful. As he pulled into the garage, an overwhelming sense of loss surprised him. He had not felt like this since the day she died. He sat in the car and let the tears flow. Finally, after calming down, he got out of the car. Dinner was light, soup and a small salad. Afterward, he sat down to watch television and immediately dozed off. The Tonight Show starring Jimmy Fallon was just ending when he awoke. He found the remote in his lap and turned off the TV. As he stood up, he noticed Peggy sitting in her chair. Her face was sad. "I'm so sorry, Bobby." He fell back into the chair and looked at her again. She was gone. "I'm sorry too, Peggy." After sitting for a few more moments, he got up and went to bed. At 2:13 a.m., Robert heard her soft rhythmic snoring next to him. He did not reach for her, remembering what had happened the last time. Instead, he relaxed and relished the sound, a sound that had comforted him all those sleepless nights over the years. The next thing he knew, the sun was up and shining through the bedroom window. Glancing at the clock, he saw that it was after 9, later than he normally slept. Vaguely remembering what he had heard during the night, he looked over at Peggy's side of the bed. The pillow was indented where she normally lay, and he caught a faint whiff of her favorite perfume. The following Tuesday was busy at the grocery store. The weather forecast called for snow and possible freezing rain on Wednesday, so customers were stocking up before the storm. Since arriving at 3 p.m., Robert had not taken a break by the time it grew close to 7. He was busy sacking an elderly woman's groceries when, out of the corner of his eye, he noticed a slender petite woman with grayish blonde hair enter the grocery aisle just beyond the checkout stand. Her back was to him. He stopped and watched her stroll down the aisle. There was something familiar about her stride. "Excuse me, young man, when are you going to finish? I'm in a hurry." His attention returned to the older woman he was helping. "Yes, ma'am, sorry. Thought I saw someone I knew." He was about to place eggs into a grocery sack when he looked up again to watch the woman moving down the aisle. As she turned the corner at the far end of the aisle, she stopped and looked straight back at Robert. It was Peggy. He dropped the eggs from about 2 feet high and raced down the aisle as Peggy turned the corner. When he got there, he was met by an empty cart. He grabbed it and frantically looked around until the owner of the store rushed up behind him. "What the heck is going on, Bob? You broke Mrs. Ferguson's eggs." Taking a deep breath, Robert blinked several times before he turned and said, "Sorry, thought I saw a shoplifter." The owner frowned, but nodded and headed toward the egg section. Robert ran his hand through his hair and felt moisture on his forehead. Looking at the empty shopping cart, he shook his head. Just as he turned to take it back to the front of the store, a cold pocket of air surrounded him. "Daddy, I insist you join us for Christmas." Robert smiled. His daughter was being protective again. "No, Susan, I felt like a third wheel at Erik's parents' house last year. Besides, I already have plans." "What plans could you possibly have?" "The men's club at church is serving Christmas dinner at St. Agnes. I volunteered." "Don't you want to be with your own family at Christmas?" "Yes, but your brother and his wife are going to North Carolina to be with her family. It's no big deal. It works that way some years. I'll see you the following weekend just like we planned." The call ended after several more attempts for him to reconsider. He learned about his children's plans for Christmas during the Thanksgiving holidays. But now, as the time grew nearer, the idea of spending it alone grew less appealing. 1 hour into his serving shift at St. Agnes, Robert knew he had made a mistake. Dave Cooper pulled him off the line and said, "What's wrong, Bob? You're throwing food at their plates, not serving it. We're supposed to be like Christ and embrace the poor." Robert stared at the floor. "I don't know. I can't help it. I see myself in those men. They've nowhere to go but here, alone and without family." He raised his head and looked at Dave, his eyes moist. Sorry, Dave. I should have realized this wasn't a good idea." His friend smiled. "My fault. I shouldn't have asked you. I didn't think about how you might feel. Go on home, Bob. We've plenty of help." Shaking his head, he said, "No, I made a commitment. I'll wash dishes and bring out clean trays. But I don't want to serve anymore." With a fatherly smile, Dave patted him on the shoulder. "Thanks, Bob." With no appetite when he arrived home, Robert made a bag of popcorn in the microwave and tried to watch Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade on DVD. After an hour, his interest waned, so he turned it off and went to bed. Sleep eluded him as he tossed and turned, his mind unable to forget the homeless, lonely men eating Christmas dinner by themselves at the church. At exactly 10:05 p.m., he sat up and stared at the digital clock. 2 years ago, to the exact minute, he made the emergency 911 call about Peggy. He lay back down and a tear rolled down his cheek. Several moments later, he heard the sound of the bathroom door opening. He watched as Peggy, dressed in her favorite nightgown, walked to her side of the bed, pulled the covers back, and lay down next to him. He rolled over and stared at her, not wanting the image to fade. She wrapped her arms around him and kissed him. He returned the embrace and hugged her tightly. She kissed him again and said, "Merry Christmas, Bobby. I've missed you." Susan's sense of panic began to grow, having not heard from her father for 2 days. Calls to his cell phone went unanswered, likewise text messages and emails. Finally, she insisted Erik drive them the 3 hours to her father's house to check on him. Afraid of what she would find, she called the local police department and asked for an officer to meet her at the house. When they arrived, the officer took her key and opened the locked front door. He returned several minutes later, talking into his shoulder radio, requesting an ambulance. He turned to her. "It appears your dad passed away in his sleep." As tears welled in her eyes, Susan rushed into the house. She found her father in bed with the covers pulled back. He was on his side, his eyes closed and a peaceful smile on his face, one she had not seen for 2 years. Then she noticed her mother's nightgown. Her hands covered her mouth as she started to sob. The nightgown appeared to be hugging her father. One. "Dump the fucking tiles out on the table, boy," Billy John Cater said gruffly to his son of only 14 years old, who sat shaking in the chair with fear. Billy J had just celebrated, if that's what it could be called, his birthday only 2 weeks earlier. He lost his mother and the only ally in his hell-filled world mere hours ago. Her illness came on fast and strong. 2 weeks ago, she had looked tired and hacked and coughed a little more, but she had been feeling well enough to help him blow his candles out on the package of his favorite vanilla Hostess zingers she had put out on the table for him after school. His daddy's still working in the shop. Now, she was nothing more than a memory, and just when he had needed her most. She never was the pretty picture of the perfect mother, not that Billy J would have known any difference, but she was the only buffer between a heartless, wicked man and him. Billy J was the only good thing his mother ever accomplished, and she told him that a couple of times lately. And now, she was gone. A scared and empty little boy now sat nervously at the kitchen table, the place where he was already far too familiar with the mason jar and the harsh punishments it delivered. His world growing up was always full of dread and anxiety for as far back as he could recollect. He didn't understand why that damn jar was on the table, but he knew better than to question his daddy about it. But then sometimes a child don't know no better than to tempt his own fate. And there it was, staring him down like a rabid dog, visually snarling at him and beckoning to question why. Why? What? I mean, why? He stuttered and tried to ask his father. His words would come out broken and made him stumble even more. "I don't know why. I ain't..." The harsh man who sat across from him, still wearing his usual dirty gray trousers and grease-covered wife-beater t-shirt he always wore, began to answer back in his usual loud and angered tone. "Don't you do it, you little fucker. Don't dare to question me, boy." But Mama's gone. I ain't done nothing to deserve no judgment today. I've been good. His father's eyes boiled with bloodshot red sternness. It easily cut deep and quick to the bone. Young Billy J couldn't imagine those eyes being from anything other than the devil himself. He had just spent hours crying in his bedroom since getting the devastating news of his mama's passing. His only refuge underneath his bed, curled up tight and wrapped in whimpers until his daddy yelled for him to get his ass to the kitchen. His father was no crier. Billy had never seen a situation where that son of a bitch ever shed a tear. Mama did, though. All the time. Seemed she was always smoking cigarettes and crying quietly to herself, muttering under her breath while always painstakingly trying to satisfy every demand his daddy had. It made no matter what it was, or how big or small. "Billy J," she'd whisper, "keeping your daddy happy is like transporting nitroglycerin across a mile of washed-out road." She'd stop about every sentence and cough a couple of times before continuing. "Honey, it's almost impossible to do without ending in a loud explosion followed by chaos and pain." She'd always touch the hair that hung over his eyes, the only sign of a mother's love he ever felt. "You'd be best to keep to yourself, son. Don't throw gasoline on his fire. Be sure to be there before he finishes calling you. Otherwise, he'll rain down hell's fury right on top of you." Billy J knew those words rang no truer. He had the scars to show it, physical and mental. Just before his daddy yelled to get in the kitchen, he was thinking about how his mama finally escaped the bastard's hold over her. But then, he was all alone with him now. The thought petrified him. No way could he stay and survive without his mama. "I'd rather get sick and die like she did. At least she finally got grace." This was the thought racing through his mind as he sat awaiting whatever was going to happen. "Don't you question me, little fucktard. Dump the fucking tiles out on the table like I done said, you little waste of a good time." Billy J didn't understand. It didn't make sense. It was an all-new way of playing the judgment game. He hated his daddy's jar his entire life, all 14 years of it, but it was always played the same way. The mason jar always put fear in him. The mere sight of it made his stomach bind up tight into twisting knots that sent a harsh burn up his chest to his throat. Somehow, Billy J suspected tonight would be much different. Even worse with Mama gone. He heard it in Daddy's voice. He could damn near smell it in the air, hovering above like soured milk, making it hard to breathe without retching. He wondered if he might just be joining his mama sooner than he had imagined. Did Daddy have it inside him to kill me? He wondered. The tension pierced deep inside, and its sting lingered around him. His daddy's eyes screamed a loathing loud and clear thunder through the hollow silence they held. He knew his daddy hated him. He made him feel worthless every day of his life. Billy J slowly reached for the jar. It was almost too big for his grip. He'd never been allowed to touch it, so the slickness of the glass made him extra nervous, afraid he might drop it. He carefully tipped it to its side and watched his different possible fates spill out onto the dirty tabletop. Some landed upside down where the black-lettered punishments remained hidden. Others sat boldly displaying their harshness in coal-black ink, easily seen with dread. Dunk, slap, and then one caught his attention. The tile that always seemed to elude him. Grace. Afraid to lift his face and meet his daddy's calloused, hardened stare, not knowing what to expect from this break in the way the game was normally played. His heart pumped inside his chest hard. He was certain the sound could be heard as loud as a freight train blasting its horn, announcing its arrival into town. He also knew his daddy enjoyed watching the panic in his eyes. 2. Pick up the grace tile and hand it over to me, boy. We won't be needing it tonight. Those words alone spoke in volume that he'd just lost his only saving chance. Even at his young age, he realized life changed in this specific moment. Not only was his mama lost, but any shot at Grace disappeared along with her. In fact, boy, he continued, as his son nervously placed the gray style within his black, grease-stained palm, calloused and tattooed with open sores from the vehicles he worked each day. "Grace is now banned forever from this house. Dead and gone, just like your lying mama." Billy John began to scoot his chair back from the table. Its legs dragged heavy and bellowed out screams against the wooden floor, matching the sharpness of Billy J's internal cries of anguish from the pain he knew would soon be announced to him. He dared to break the rule once more. The rule his mama warned him of, but he opened his mouth. "Why, Daddy? What did I do wrong? Is it 'cause I cry for my mama who just died?" he begged. "That's all I can think of that I did. I already miss her bad." "Miss her? You killed her slow, boy, from the day you ripped her lady parts up, entering this world ass backwards. And you've been choking the life out of her ever since." He guffawed a wicked chortle which burned as it rang loudly in his ears. "Yeah, you were never wanted, boy, and you've been nothing but a goddamn nuisance ever since. Mama told me she loved me and she hated you. I didn't kill her. You said it was lung cancer from the cigarettes." His tear-filled eyes began to sting, but he insisted to remain defiant and hold strong with his resolve. "If anybody killed her, it's you. She was always scared of you. You fucker. Maybe that's what killed her? The monster inside you? The one that makes you drink and yell and hit?" Billy John finished scooting out of his chair by flinging it backwards through the air until it slammed loudly into the oven. "Get over here, you little bastard." He opened his hand that held the gray style. It stared back at him as boldly as his rebelling son did. That angered him even more, causing him to toss it into the trash piled up on the floor. "You're gonna pay for those sharp words you think you're man enough to fucking use. There won't ever be grace in this house again. Never. You hear me clear about that, boy? You're gonna fucking regret believing you're man enough to talk shit to me. I'm the fucking judge here. I'm the goddamn hangman when need be, and that need be coming on stronger than a hurricane, boy." The veins in his temples bulged and his normally pasty white skin became beet red with vile anger. Billy J quickly realized he had goaded his daddy beyond a point he had ever crossed. It scared him knowing the pain and chaos that was going to follow from the nitroglycerin exploding. But he knew he had been judged for the very last time by the son of a bitch he called Daddy. "There never was any goddamn grace in this house, you fuck. I wish it was you that was dead, not my mama. You never deserved her, and I know she's glad as hell she's gone and away from you." A closed fist flew from nowhere and contacted Billy J's left side of his face with an instant thunderous explosion of hurt. It sent him staggering backwards as he stumbled from the chair to the floor. His head smacked hard against the wall and then onto the hardwood flooring as his blurred vision went instantly dark and dead quiet. 3. His ears throbbed and rang. Billy J's eyelids barely parted, allowing him to see the bourbon bottle gripped in his daddy's hand. He wasn't sure exactly where he was or what had happened. His temples pounded. The left side of his face felt numb, yet the skin burned like fire. His vision lacked clarity when he attempted to coyly survey the surroundings. His eyelids mere slits and he kept his head perfectly still. He shivered. His skin was cold, wet, and felt shriveled. After squinting a little more to bring his awareness closer into focus, he realized it was the bathroom. He was in the tub, his father sitting on the stool across from him. Terror surrounded him instantly like the frigid water he was lying in. The tile that spelled out dunk came instantly into his consciousness. Had that tile spilled out onto the table tonight? Remembering the last time it happened, his panicked flailing arms fighting to breathe in air, but only water rushing into his lungs. He had been dunked, so many times in his past, it brought the worst fears and memories ever imagined. It was far worse than any of the other punishments that were etched onto the small square wooden tiles Daddy's jar held. "How'd I end up here?" he questioned himself. He quietly attempted some recollection. Bits and pieces seemed to be just out of his reach, yet he was ever so careful to keep the fact he was now awake concealed. He knew one thing for sure, and he repeated it to himself internally over and over. Run away. As soon as the bastard drank enough whiskey to close his eyes, he would quietly leave. Run away. Tonight. He held no clue where he would go, but he would put one foot in front of the other without question and run, never looking back. He knew he had awoken the devil today, and there would be no bedding him back down ever again. He'd have to either kill it or sneak off in the dark. At 14, he held no knowledge on how to kill someone, nor the knowledge if he could really follow through should he conjure up a way to do it. His daddy was strong. His daddy drank the devil's blood every night and day. No doubt they were one and the same with powers unbeatable. For now, he just needed to fight the shivers and remain still as a statue like he were dead. He mustn't let Daddy know he was awake. Wait him out. Let him keep drinking from that damned bottle. Please keep drinking, he begged inside his heart and soul. In an instant, he wished he hadn't let the thought about his mama being gone in his head again. It was that one sniffle he let slip that gave him up. It garbled up to the surface of the cold bathwater and drew the devil's attention away from the whiskey and back to his evil agenda. In his peripheral vision, his eye that wasn't swollen closed saw the arm swoop down fast on him. Black, greasy fingers opening wider as they grabbed at his hairline and jerked him under. 4. Billy J's arms and legs flailed wildly as water doused the walls and floor from his kicking and thrashing. His daddy's grip held firm, squeezing his head down tight against the iron tub's porcelain bottom. He desperately needed to draw a deep breath, but he knew what would happen. Instead, cold water would fill his throat and chest cavity, not the oxygen his lungs screamed for. He continued to hold his breath and fight until he was about to surrender and suck in as hard as he could, hoping for the air his body craved would be there, but knowing it wouldn't. Daddy's hand gripped his hair and held him down, then suddenly reversed the action. Billy J was jerked to the surface just in time to inhale one quick coughing breath mixed with heavy droplets of choking water. The young boy's mind prepared for another plunge. He had been here before. The procedure drilled into memory. His punishment wasn't over yet. Two things now fought for his brain's attention and control. Survival first, and then revenge. He wanted to kill the fucker responsible for his horrendous torture. He knew it for sure. He barely got a half breath before his head was shoved back under, eyes still open wide, now blurred from the rush of cold stinging water that flooded them. The large murky silhouette hovered above him and created a fuzzy canvas of motion just above the water's surface as his head lashed back and forth, splashing waves of turmoil. He frantically searched for another life-saving gulp of air, but the monster continued his wrath of towering over him. It held him under with the strength of what was certainly a creature from the deepest bowels of hell. After the third or fourth repeated action, the hand gripping his hair threw his head back into the water, but this time there was no pressure to hold him under. Left for dead, it was over for now. The figure got up from his knees and loudly muttered, "That's what you get for killing my housekeeper, cook, and piece of ass, boy. Now you got fend for yourself like a real man." And he left the room, likely in search for his goddamned whiskey bottle he loved so much. The only damn thing he ever loved. Billy J lay motionless, almost lifeless, shivering and spent. He desperately gasped deep breaths and sputtered water from his mouth. Seems Mama would have to wait to meet up with him again, though. He had somehow survived his daddy's fury once more. Too afraid to climb out of the tub and dry off, he instead waited to make sure the devil was passed out. It was cold, and he softly cried ice-cool tears. They rained continually down his cheeks. Light muddled sobs echoed around the frigid iron and porcelain sides of the tub. hovering just above the water's surface, reverberating atop the now placid calm. The aftermath of the assault. Now came the planning stage of running. 5. Billy J held no clue how long he had been lying in the tub. He did finally risk pulling the plug, hoping it would drain its contents without sound. He grabbed a wet towel from the floor and pulled it over his still water-soaked clothes, wrapped himself tightly into a cocoon, and nestled in. Billy J searched for any warmth he could find, his ears perked and tuned in for constant guard of any sounds that may stir outside the closed door. He was trapped like a frightened, wounded rabbit in a cage. Freedom was just outside the closed door and around the corner. But where was the fox, and could he avoid him on the way out? He knew he needed to grab things before sneaking away. He wasn't ever coming back again. He knew that much for sure. And his daddy was right. He would be fending for himself from now on. Billy's mind drifted to a time his mama had taken him to a matinee movie several years back. It was the only special day he could remember having. Not certain why it came to him now, but the memory somehow reassured him. My Side of the Mountain was the title. It was about a young boy who took off on his own and lived up in the mountains all by himself. He survived. Billy J smiled, but it was mixed with worried apprehension. I could survive too, couldn't I? He wondered. He knew there was no chance of living if he stayed. He couldn't. He wouldn't last another thrashing, never another flogging. It felt like hours before Billy mustered up enough bravery to crawl out from the tub and attempt to peek outside. He twisted the knob ever so carefully. The frightened and shivering boy feared each click of the door handle mechanism, seeming thunderous enough to wake the beast. Maybe he was still so medicated by the brown liquid from attempting to erase the guilt from his torturous actions. Billy J guffawed, knowing his daddy held no form of any guilt at all. He cautiously pushed the door open, then tiptoed carefully down the hallway, avoiding all the squeaky spots past the messy living room. He spied an empty bottle tipped on its side across the coffee table, lying beside his mama's ashtray, still sitting piled up high with cigarette butts. Another near-empty bottle was barely clutched in his daddy's hand. It hovered just above the messy floor below the couch he was passed out on. Light snores filled the room with no visible movement from the body sprawled out across the filthy stained cushions. Cautiously, he continued to walk down the hallway, still stepping over and around the boards that may give his movements up. He made it to his room, and after entering, he quickly and silently opened and shut drawers, pulling out the things he thought he would need to make it on his own. In his young, foggy mind, he was grasping at straws. He held no clue of what the future would bring him or just what he would need to take to face such an obstacle. Money would be needed for sure, and he did know where the cookie jar that held his daddy's precious stash was. He would retrieve its contents on the way out. He'd also take every fucking bit of it too. He owed that son of a bitch nothing. Billy J stuffed clothes into his backpack, grabbed his pocket knife his mama had recently given him, causing another tear from thinking about her. He shoved the thought away as he glanced one more time around, looking for anything he was forgetting. There was nothing left but bad memories in this room now. It would be easy to leave and never look back. Knowing the path all too well, he silently tiptoed back down the hallway, avoiding the noisy floorboards by carefully weaving back and forth between the walls. He knew each one well. He had done it 1,000,000 times before. Upon reaching the kitchen entryway, he quickly spied the cookie jar on the top shelf. After setting his backpack down, he lifted a chair and carried it over to the counter, then tacitly placed it beside the cupboard. A couple of careful steps up, both hands methodically clasped the heavy jar tightly within his grip before kneeling and placing it quietly down on the counter. He took a huge breath after accomplishing the task without mishap, and then pulled the lid from the jar and looked in. There it was, the roll of bills he had seen his daddy stuff inside every time a customer paid him for a car repair. It was thick and had a $20 bill on the top that wrapped around all the others and was rubber banded into a bundle. It was a fortune for sure. There was something else resting in a clump next to the roll. It was soft, and as he attempted to lift it up, he found it heavy as it jingled. He realized It was a sock when he continued to lift it out. The fabric stretched from the weight of what was hidden inside. After retrieving it and placing it beside the jar on the countertop, the fabric ballooned out with more clinks and clatter. He immediately knew what was inside before pulling the opening wide enough to see its contents. It was change, dimes and nickels mixed. By its weight, it must be several more dollars inside, he thought. He knew he should just take the cash, abandon the lid and jar on the counter and leave. But that's not what he did. He knew his mama hated her kitchen being a mess, even though Daddy never put anything back and trashed every corner of the house. Out of habit of trying to please her, he set the money roll down and maneuvered the lid over the jar, nestling it almost back into position. That's when he lost his grip. The lid clanked on the jar top and then slid down with a series of rattles ending in a clunk. Fear instantly gripped Billy J as he grabbed the lid to silence it. Frozen in place, he turned to see the cash roll and sock full of change sitting in plain sight. If Daddy came into the room to see what caused the racket, he would instantly foresee his plan with his backpack, the money, and fresh clothes he was wearing. Billy J knelt frozen in place, petrified as the explosion from the nitroglycerin being rattled and jarred. 6. The bottle of whiskey must have done its job. Seconds morphed into a minute, and Daddy never stumbled into the kitchen. Luck was on his side. The mistake he had made failed to awaken the beast. Billy J grabbed the money roll and quickly stuffed it into his pack and then shouldered it, ready to start his run. That's when something caught the corner of his eye, the one that wasn't swollen almost shut. It stood firm and staunch like a tall silo in an empty field. The goddamn mason jar. It beckoned him to come wield it in his hands again, to feel the power its contents held, the authority of doling out its punishments. He sidestepped the chair, grabbed up the sock, and walked over to the table, eyes fixed as if in a trance. Setting the sock down, he picked up the jar, unable to fight the desire to do so. He absorbed the various tiles and the words emblazoned in bold black etchings that lay haphazardly across the table. He quietly spoke each one as he picked it up between his fingers and felt their sharp edges before silently sliding them back into the jar. Dark. Slap. Hit. Dunk. There was, of course, no longer a tile scribed with grace on its face. Daddy had removed it and then tossed it into the scattered trash spread across the floor. He scanned the room, searching quickly but intently for it. An internal thought instantly overtook his thinking and he quietly uttered, "There was never any fucking grace in this house. Why start now? He doesn't deserve it. More than anybody else, he's owed the worst of judgments." Vengeance overwhelmed his previous desire to just run. Instead, he felt compelled to doling out the consequences himself of the judgment game and its wrath. He'd been the only recipient his entire life of that damned mason jar. His mama came very close several times with threats of its outcome. No doubt about it, she too got beat all the time. But the game? It was reserved for him alone. "Well now, it's Daddy's turn," he whispered, and slowly, methodically began to swirl the jar around in circles. The tiles spilled over each other as his hand began to shake them, mocking his daddy's hands he had watched so many times himself. Swallowed up in fear of which wooden tile would spill out onto the table, which form of hideous cruelty would be used on him. He paid no attention to how loud the sound of his actions made. He didn't care. He was under the spell of the jar. He longed to hear the sound of the angered rattlesnakes quivering their tails in warning of impending doom. The sound that in the past instilled terror inside. Just like Daddy in an unspoken instant. He halted the jar and tilted it slowly to the tabletop. So careful of an angle steep enough to call the tiles to slide towards the rim, but slow enough to control only one to breach the edge. Just like his daddy did. Carefully jiggling it until that one and only wooden piece gently spilled onto the surface. A slow, timely sting like the venom being pumped into one's bloodstream. A small square of bait fell silently onto the table, but landed upside down, leaving his daddy's retribution still unseen. Billy J's heart boldly pounded within his chest like big bass drums from the school band, hammering an explosive cadence of anticipation. His normal feelings of fear now transformed and converted into power and wrath. It felt awkward and unfamiliar, but it felt so damned fulfilling. He set the jar down beside the faceless tile and reached his hand out. Billy J lifted it in between his trembling fingers, hesitating for only a moment before slowly turning it over. 7. An eerie stillness swallowed Billy J's thoughts as well as the room's emptiness when his eyes read the word etched into the tile's wooden face. He had never imagined the excitement coursing throughout his veins would be this kind of exhilaration. He had always been on the receiving end where only terror was felt. He was never the one in charge who doled out the consequence of the jar. That difference between receiving and giving such a verdict battled a tug-of-war inside his mind. He had always felt guiltless, and any punishment from the jar was unfair. He had committed no wrongdoing. His daddy, on the other hand, would be overwhelmingly justified with any reprimand doled out from the jar. Daddy's entire life was an unending crime against him and his mama. His daddy could possibly drink his guilt away from his own goddamned conscience, but he couldn't drown it from his or his mama's. He slowly laid the small wooden scribed punishment face up onto the table beside the jar. His eyes moved upward as if he were able to stare into his daddy's eyes across the table, as he had felt him do to him so many times before. In his make-believe moment of wielding total power and control, he smiled an evil and mocking smile, then quietly but firmly spoke the single-syllable word. Beat. He knew he didn't have the strength in his young body to beat his daddy bad enough to counter his ability to strike back and reprise. A feeling of letdown hovered inside his head, but he found himself unable to just leave the tile lying on the table and walk away with its judgment unanswered. He scanned the kitchen looking for a way where he could overcome and carry out its justice. His frown turned upward into an evil grin when the answer came to him in the form of the coin-filled sock boldly staring back at him. Yeah, the sock that held part of his daddy's precious fucking savings. What could be more fitting? He questioned. Billy J reached over and picked it up. It was weighty in his hands. It could certainly do some major damage in the right place. Without much more of a thought, he tightly grasped it and ominously walked through the kitchen's entryway into the living room, the change stretching the sock towards the floor from the weight of the coins pulling downward. His daddy still lay passed out on the couch, his bottle nearly ready to drop from his hand to the floor. His wretched eyes still closed tightly in slumber. Light snores rhythmically escaped his callous lips. He hated the man he now stood over. His eyes coldly stared at the evil in his father's face. The weathered lines across his forehead, the graying stubble that shadowed his cheeks masking any form of humanity there. He was disgusted with everything about him. The way he drank, the way he treated him and his mama, even the smallest of things like the filthy clothes he wore and the careless way he trashed the home they lived in. He loathed him. Billy J wrapped the stretched sock twice around his right hand, drawing it closer to his wrist, and began to slowly swing it back and forth in his tightened grip like the pendulum of the grandfather's clock sitting in the corner of the room. Click, clock, tick, tock. Feeling the heaviness of it as gravity helped increase the weight of the coins, pulling his muscles to tighten. He imagined the weight of the coins smacking down onto the face of the devil lying unsuspecting before him. He instantly and effortlessly swung his hand upward as it traveled high above his head, almost brushing the ceiling, hovering no more than a millisecond while it towered above his daddy's head. Then, without hesitation, the weighted pendulum swung quickly downward, hard and fast as if the hangman's lever had been pulled. The sock's landing ended with a dull thud as crimson-red liquid exploded from his victim's face and a shower of brightly beaded droplets painting the couch and walls. The explosion was followed with an immediate sharp groan as the whiskey bottle sanctimoniously fell from his grip to the floor with a quiet thump that echoed above the moaning wails of his agony. His bloodied eyes appeared to cry as they attempted to focus while his hands quickly crept towards his face to nurse the pain-filled swelling and jellied flesh. Billy J could barely see his daddy's shocked reaction through his own swollen eye he had suffered earlier by the now curled-up body on the sofa. A wicked smile grew across Billy J's face, and it was indeed the satisfying smile he had hoped it would be. One of accomplishment. He had finally given the punishment his daddy deserved for the years of abuse he had doled out to them, his mama and him. The mean and vulgar filth he had spewed through the years, the repeated rapes and beatings his mama had endured, his own suffering from his unrelenting and inhumane tortures, the lack of any attempt at love being shown to either one of them, the drunken rages from out of nowhere. He never imagined just how good such a horrible thing like this act could feel. It was guiltless pleasure. It was emotional payback. It was an epiphany, and he felt its instant addiction react inside, telling him he would need another fix. "How do you like that, you fucking bastard?" He spoke in a monotone yet deathly calm voice as he coldly stared at his daddy's agony. The fucker's cowardice attempt to cover his face as he watched his young son swing his arm upward for another revenge-filled strike he would be unable to halt. A moment later, Billy J again pulled his arm down hard with all the force he could muster, connecting another bone-crunching blow to his daddy's face and hands. A loud yelp of brutal excruciation instantly bellowed out, overshadowing the sound of the coins within the sock jingle-jangling in chaotic chimes. "That one was for Mama, you worthless fuck." Young Billy took his time to remove his backpack as he watched his daddy roll up in a ball of agony and cry out in tears, "Please, stop!" Tears like he had never witnessed before from the man who so easily gifted those same tears of pain to family. He calmly stowed the bloody change-filled sock into the pack, placing it next to the money roll, and then threw it across his back. He walked a bit taller with pride through the front door. He didn't feel any urge to look back again, knowing there was nothing left there for him to miss. He did feel as if he were leaving one thing behind, though. It only took a flash to realize what it was. It was his last bit of innocence. The devil had just stolen his soul today, but it had felt good. It felt really good. He had a purpose now with his new start in life. He could now cuss like his daddy, like a grown-up. And of course, he could now judge and execute punishments, just like his daddy used to. He didn't need no fucking mason jar to do it. One foot after the other almost skipped through the yard as the sun dipped just below the horizon of the new chapter he was entering. The world was now his for the taking. He felt alive for the first time ever. And it felt good.
Grande Nono died making a living, like Papa. He was born with his blue denim sleeves rolled up. He and Grande Nona are buried just a few miles south of the Apuan Mountains, on the Alps Italian side. They've been rotting away in a small village cemetery near the town of Caravaggio. Caravaggio, Italy, is in the province of Bergamo in Lombardy, Italy, 40 kilometers northeast of Milan's municipality. Carrara is in central Italy. Carrara is in the provinces of Massa and Carrara. The region is famous for the white and blue-gray marble quarried there. The brilliant, almost translucent blue and gray exist as arteries and veins, frozen in memoriam. The Carrione River gushes in the winter through the canyons of the region. Flash floods in the spring have been known to cleanse citizens clear out into the Ligurian Sea. At first glance, the Apuan Alps of northwest Tuscany's Carrara region are pure white. You can imagine snow being born in the high castle crags. Early train travelers through the regional mountains had been cautioned of the risk of blindness due to the marble dust and glare from all the whiteness. The talc of powder is said to be under the control of no one other than the wind, a stiff wind that wants nothing to do with humankind. Most travel guides, even today, will tell you the Carrara region is famous for three things: marble, anarchy, and pig fat. This unlikely trio is intertwined as deeply as the mineral veins striating the marbled mountains. Since ancient Roman times, Carrara's Apuan Alps have supplied marble for some of the world's most prized sculptures. Carrara is the marble of Michelangelo's Pieta, Jean-Antoine Houdin's George Washington, and New Delhi's vast Akshardham temple. The stone is blessed with luminosity. Its networks of blue arteries and veins, nature's psychological Rorschach test, ranges from grayish to purple. In monolithic form, it can support the sky, like Half Dome in Yosemite, California. It has been winnowed down into the translucence of light itself in thin slabs, a fitting lid on an iridescent coffin. My name is David. I'm a little softer than marble, but much colder. It's taken a while to get here, but that's what you get when you grow up in the middle of a nightmare. This story isn't so much about me. It's mostly about us. Yes, dear reader, you and me, us humans, with all our ugliness, beauty, and pain. It's about the idiosyncrasies and occasional flaws of raising children. Children whose only intent is to live once born. There's not one baby book available online or in a storefront about how to raise a monster. I can assure you, the parents that know how to don't need any damned instructions. Don't get me wrong, I enjoy a wonderful life, especially now that I've lived alone for just over a decade. Papa and Mama are back in northern Italy, going on 11 years now. They will be back, not to worry. In most ways, they've never really left. They are like shadows that remain hidden, but for midnight. When I say that they are not really being gone, by that I mean there are very few places in this rundown house where they don't exist. And outside, they're out there too. Papa is in the drippy faucet, the one he couldn't fix. And so I put up with it and wait. It's just off their bedroom on the second floor. Now that they're gone, I sleep in their queen. Papa is in the crazy garden. Jesus, it's insanely productive. Most of us Italians are birthed with green thumbs. He's no exception. Hell, he's placed enough bullshit in the dirt to turn the backyard into a greenhouse. The soil can't help itself. It's rich and loamy. He's in the tomato stakes, the ones he used his machete to axe into 6-foot lengths. The stakes are round and made out of 2-inch dried bamboo. He uses 4 to stand up the cages meant to confine the beautiful green and red of the plants. Papa makes the wire cages too. It seems he makes everything except the water. In July, once the plants have taken hold, he uses the iron enclosures to jail all the tomatoes with cheap labor until they are forced to ripen. The rake, he's damned well in it. Papa's in the sweaty oil on the tacky handle. He's also in the missing hickory slivers that have ended up in his calloused palms. I can even feel him in the shovel, the square and the round one. Papa's strong hands are there, the ones that he'd forced around my throat. The rounded shovel has a gravedigger's blade, having killed a rat or two. It acts as guillotines and can be used to take out Napoleon's armies of screaming tomato worms, as well as any meandering garden snake. Father is in the pantry, more stubborn than any simile. I swear to it. He's in the ugly green wooden cabinet, the cabinet built onto one of the garage walls. He had inherited it from the previous homeowners. Papa was there when he smashed the planked wooden door on my curious fingers after he'd carelessly left it unlocked. He was as quiet as a panther in the single-car parking space. He'd reinforced the shelves. "Extra support never hurt nothing," he'd said. "If I catch you climbing up them again, I'll crack your eardrums open like a walnut shell." Brandied cherries, thorny blackberries, and drunken raisins, a container of bay leaves, dried leaves broad enough to cover your crotch. They're all in there, his damned pantry. Canned jars of minestrone soups, pickled venison with bone broth. Broth he'd used to boil meat off a cat's ribs. I love Papa. I can't get enough of him, even though he'd never taught me a damned thing or showed me an ounce of affection. He'd beaten me so hard once. He used a messy summer fly swatter. The kids at school teased me for more than a week. They'd called me porch face because of the clumsy screen door in the back of the house. I wouldn't dare tell them the truth. Don't get me wrong, I truly love him, Papa, way over in Italy. But if not for the distance, I'd kill him. It's like when ivory dominoes fall, Italy. One after the other. First cousin Adriana broke her back. She'd been living taking care of Nono and Nona in their 2-bedroom inherited cottage. Winter had been a bastarda that year. Those cloudy cumuli scoundrels just wouldn't let up or leave. The storms had come over the icebox Apuan Mountains like some uninvited, frost-bitten diesel train. They huffed and puffed their swollen blue faces, clean out of Switzerland and Austria. The back stoop and steps had frozen. In the last atmospheric disturbance, Adriana had forgotten all their scratchy linens she'd hung out on the clothesline in the AM. When she'd clipped on the wooden clothespins, there had been sunshine clawing itself over the horizon. The landscape was frozen, but the fragile sun rays had been as dry as a church mouse fart. She'd seen them as flags, all the sheets and towels. They'd flapped parallel in the same direction of the sleet. If the sky hadn't been so windy, they might have frozen all their stiffness in place. Both feet had come out from underneath her hefty girth. She attempted to scoot across the stoop and down a short run of stairs. Adriana's heard the crunch before, the time she chopped fresh kindling for the cottage's cast-iron stove. She'd cracked her cervical spine in 3 places. The medico had ordered rest and that she lay as stiff as a corpse for at least 2 months. I don't know what in the hell they call them in Italy, but the doctor had also thrown a shitload of benzodiazepines at her to uplift her mood, he'd said. Adriana had sounded as if she was a happy zombie. She'd begun to slur her words, so she used the neighbor on the other end of the phone. This neighbor lady, Aurelia, was one of the few in the village who knew broken English. Adriana had stirred up the whole neighborhood with her high maintenance and melodramatics, most likely from her being high. In short order, Aurelia, the helpful neighbor, quit. She'd had enough of nursing Adriana, as well as cooking and feeding Nono and Nona. She'd shouted in Italian when she'd left the cottage for the last time, "I'm not going to be used as some kind of crazy finger puppet." That's when Mother and Father's trip was a done deal. Hearing all this, Mother and Father had jumped on the first international flight out of San Francisco to Milan. Apparently, Caravaggio, Italy is another Hotel California, like the Eagles' hit song. Once you arrive, you can never leave. By God, nothing was going to happen to Nono and Nona. My parents had too much invested, not the least the $30-odd they'd send to Italy every month. I'm sure their leaving had nothing to do with any future inheritance. Back at the house. Although Mama is in Italy, she's never really left the house. She's in the pasta sauce she taught me to make. Buttloads of fresh garlic, a pinch of brown sugar, a teaspoon of vinegar, fresh basil, Papa's rusty tomatoes, and her secret weapon, Italian ground sausage with fennel. There are enough jars of Mama's pasta sauce in the green pantry to fill up a Venetian gondola. I almost forgot. Add about 1/2 cup of tawny port wine, not the cooking kind. In northern Italy, that's how we roll. She'd used her intoxicating pasta sauce and pasta to keep Papa fat and uncomfortable, too uncomfortable for kinky sex. Mama had been the comet shine in the scratched porcelain sink. I'm messy. She cleaned the kitchen floor good enough to eat off, vacuumed the rug in front of the big screen TV, left wheel marks resembling perfectly furrowed OCD rows of corn, truer than any in Kansas. I have stacks of dirty dishes on the coffee table. The washer broke, and now I'm using the dishwasher to clean all my clothes. I almost forgot. Mama is down the drain in the bathtub and out the sewer pipes, swimming toward the main line. Everything she ever did is out there. I hope the witch stays in Italy, never comes home. Mama's into saving. She's a penny pincher. She'd hoarded change, mainly the spare dimes that could fit into Papa's discarded whiskey and cognac, Toro Gordo see-through tubes. The nasty cigars never left his mouth. Each tube was gifted at storing their designated dimes, each dime held snugly in its place. Dimes were tight, seemingly pinching themselves into place. Each dime a fool, should they even think of leaving the nested affection. I've spent every one of those mercury-headed sons of bitches. Those President Franklin D. Roosevelt, in God we trust, counterfeit dimes. Money is evil. It needed to be punished. I gave them all away at the Thunder Valley Casino, just north of Sacramento. It had taken a lot of liquor, anger, and time to spend the 48 tubes of stolen dimes. Losing had never felt so good. Returning at 3 a.m. Saturday morning, I'd slept most of the weekend away, having gorged on an all-you-can-eat buffet. Canning. With COVID and all, and since Mama's cooking is in Italy, I've taken up canning. Canning has become extremely popular with my generation. I am a millennial. It's a safe, effective, and simple process, and it's crazy inexpensive. Mother made me inexpensive. Cheap enough to toss away if she could have gotten away with it. She gave me to Papa, expecting he'd use me up. I hate her as much as sin, with all her paternal conspiracies. People can take advantage of canning to preserve just about anything. Fruits, peaches, plums, thorny and bloody blackberries picked in the boiling sun along the Yuba River. Vegetables, soups, sauces, and meats. Damned right, all kinds of proteins. In the late 1700s, that crazy war genius, Napoleon Bonaparte, commissioned a regional search for a better method to preserve food. He believed that an army travels on its stomach. He was looking for a less expensive and more efficient way to feed his armies. He intended to make food last longer and give his armies nutritional food, meat, to build up their strength. Their heritage of strength is what allowed the troops to perform more of their carnage in all the battles. And so, Napoleon proposed a hefty bounty to anyone who could come up with a better method of preserving food in quantity with a long shelf life, even though most of Napoleon's soldiers had a limited expiration date. A genius named Nicholas Appert had claimed the prize, though it took until 1810 for him to perfect his discovery. But, like most time-proven inventions used for the military, it would take about 50 years before the methodology and know-how would trickle down to the average family. Think of Ronald Reagan's Star Wars. By 1858, this brilliant cylindrically shaped man, John Mason, had invented the iconic, reusable Mason jar. The Mason jar is the gold standard of canning, even today. The best thing Mama taught me before she left was how to can. I do thank her for that, if nothing else, and I'll be grateful to her for the rest of my life. The supplies. 1. Boiling water bath canner or a large, deep sauce pot with a lid and a rack. 2. Glass preserving jars, lids, and bands. Always start with new lids. 3. Common kitchen utensils, such as a wooden spoon, ladle, and paring knife. 4. Quality ingredients, fresh fruits and vegetables. 5. Jar lifter. 6. Home canning funnel. 7. Bubble freer and headspace tool. I admit, it's become an obsession, canning. It's been more than a hot minute, well, over 10 years now, since Papa and Mama left for Italy. I might have to whisper, but I think I'm a better canner than my missing Mama. You heard me right. Mama went missing while in Italy. She's still missing. If I sound a little matter-of-fact, well, for Christ's sakes, I am. I don't miss her a bit. Hell, she's everywhere I turn in this 2-story, falling-apart clapboard house. Let's get back to canning. I don't have time for terribly long stories. Bitches, I am the RuPaul Andre Charles of canning. I've got canning game. Over the years, I've mastered the art. Yes, you heard me correct. It's an art. Squatty, stainless steel jar lids. Lids that stack in gorgeous, shiny rows in Papa's garage pantry. Tall, long mason jars. The glass of stars, full of peaches, their skin sloughing off. Don't you just love the word slough? I eat the juicy peaches, skin first. I've preserved kidney beans and canned eggplant, the kind that resembles the emoji penis. I've canned olives as dark as jackal eyes, red pimentos for pupils. Green-fingered asparagus, some as thick as longshoremen's thumbs, The rest, as long as your middle finger, I've stored them all. I figure all the canned goods in Papa's green cupboard should last at least 5 frickin' years. Think about it. Not having to shop for food, all the plague masks, all the germs, the disgusting people. I quit my job. I worked for the state of California in IT. My employer was the Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation. It was a nice fit for the longest time, the past 20 years. But with all the write-ups, suspensions, and disciplinary action, I told the governor of the Golden State of California to shove his state job up his Department of Controller's ass. I'd had it. The talking behind my back and taunting had gone on for months. I was accused of sexual harassment, gender insensitivity, and for keeping less than standard hygienic practices. It was never written up formally, but my immediate supervisor had also accused me of excessive flatulence. He'd said, "I'll save you all the embarrassment by not having it on the record." They assumed Father had simply disappeared in the woods. He'd been hiking a lot after Mama's disappearance. Well, he'd disappeared too. It was in early February. It had been snowing a lot. The Apuan forests were deep and dark, all that bullshit. Think of me as the red stapler man in the hit movie Office Space. I'd been placed in a corner next to a dingy wall at the end of a long row of cubicles. I'd been made fun of for the longest time. There had been food on my shirt that I'd made sure to wash at least once a month. The broken clip on my suspenders, my olive-oiled hair, a litany of complaints. They'd said, "He's a pig, eats most of his food out of jars, he farts like a bull in a software china shop, he scrambles and breaks every damned software application and Microsoft Excel spreadsheet account that he touches, his math is sloppy, he doesn't add up." "Fuck you!" I shouted when Kevin won the yearly IT award. It wouldn't have been so bad, but I used the third floor's intercom. This girl named Nancy had turned me in for wearing real pig's ears for Halloween. I thought it was appropriate. I used elastic and Velcro and had dried them out. "Fuck you!" I'd shouted when they'd told me who it was that complained. "Fuck all of you, Nancy," I'd said. "You bitches are going to end up in a mason canning jar." I was fired the very next day. They walked me clear down the block to the bus stop. Okay, I get this feeling that you are making fun of me too. This is so personal, and I've been sharing so much of myself. I know you think I'm crazy, reader. You can't fool me. Don't flatter yourself, smarty pants. You think I killed my mother and father and jarred them. No, and hell no! I'm in Papa's garage. He won't mind. I'm using his workbench vise. Grande Nono had a workbench too, over there in Italy. He'd used it to sharpen all his slaughtering tools and wheat scythe. Grande Nono and I had always gotten along. I loved him. He's the one that taught me why the sheep in the foothills of the Alps have 2 downhill legs shorter than the other, walking the hills and all in one direction. Papa did everything big, including installing a commercial-sized workbench vise. His vise is industrial red and shiny as glass. I tighten it, tighter and tighter. Nothing ever escaped Father. He held me down, 2 knees on my back, both hands in my long, pissy hair. I'd wet the bed again. As I grew older, he'd do this, but for other reasons. I turn the handle. I have the Vice's dog fixed in place. I watch as the moving jaw moves in the direction of the stationary jaw. The main screws seem to elongate as the vice grips tighter, one of life's paradoxes. I crank and crank until Papa's double-barreled shotgun is fixed in place. I saw and I saw, using the hacksaw. As the storm shakes the rafters, I play Papa's favorite CD using his cheap flea market vintage player. How he loved him some Brahms, especially the classic haunted lullabies, steeped in all the Mephistophelian memories they evoked. He loved the anxious melody, all the nervous piano keys, the white noise that kept his demons at bay. Piano Concerto No. 2 was his favorite, with its assemblage of Stradivarius violins fluttering their hyaline wings off. How it reminds me of the times I'd torn the wings off the butterflies, whenever the pain ferreted itself into the light, sniffing for vengeance. Most of the cold steel barrel falls to the floor. I sand and sand what's left of the barrel until it's smooth to the touch. It never heats up. It remains cold. I snap on the TV in the family room. It takes a while to find the channel with only white noise. Next to me, on the makeshift end table, is a mason jar. It's filled to the brim with pickled pig's feet broth, mostly bitter vinegar. I grasp the jar in my sweaty palm. I swish the dog's eyes in a clockwise direction. I place the vacuum-packed jar back on the card table next to the couch. The age-darkened sheep's eyes spin and whirl in a circular motion of sight, no longer tethered to their brains by any pesky optic nerves or even semblance of reality. I pick up the jar again. I stare back and spin the wolf's eyes in a counterclockwise direction. I smile. I place the cyclone of deception and conspiracy back on the table. Now, I can use my index finger on the trigger. The shotgun barrel is so much shorter now. Using my toes was unrealistic since I've gained so much weight after being terminated. Terminated. What a harsh word, isn't it? Because of all the nutritious canned protein, I've become a little cherub. There's no way my chubby 2 toes were going to blast me over the moon. Dear reader, if you've gotten this far, I'm truly sorry. You'll have to sit on the couch now, directly across from me, and watch. You'll have company. They are watching me too. The feral eyes are strobe lights, a horrific merry-go-round of sight. The son's a bitch. Around and around they go. The room fades to black. The TV splatters. You know most of the rooms in the house by now. After you puke your guts out, you run toward the leaky shower in the master bath. The blistering hot water can't rub your bloody skin off fast enough. Fuck the crime scene, you shout at the top of your lungs into the ceiling. You contemplate how your pretty world has just shit its pants. You exit the shower. The room has turned into a psych ward spa. Everything is a vapor. You splash ice water on your face over the sink in front of the massive mirror. You rub and rub at the steam on the glass. Directly behind you, in the mirror, is your new reality. You can see it clearly now. It stands bleeding, broad-shouldered. Somehow, the brawny shoulders are holding up a broken marble bowl of cherries. The bloody cherries are globing over the rim of the bowl. After you've determined the broken bowl is what's left of my skull, I make you feel the icy barrel against your flesh, directly behind your pounding heart. Now, sons of bitch, the lights really do go out.
Look, Daddy, an airplane!
My son Cedric pointed up at the sky at the brilliant metallic dot, cutting a white line across the clear blue. This was something of a family tradition. When I saw airplanes as a little boy, I had to point them out. Now, my youngest took up the mantle. His older brother Colin had long since moved past such foolish, childish things. We wouldn't have seen this one if it hadn't been for the thinning leaves of the trees. We were playing a bit of catch before dinner, and the airplane had glinted at us from behind the bare topmost branches. The ball exchanged hands between my son and I a few more times before he exclaimed,
Daddy, Daddy, I see another one! Another one!
I humored him and shielded my eyes and squinted. The air traffic overhead had increased in seconds. There were indeed 2 more planes, just like the first, rather unusual for the skies over Hayrock Glen. The evening sunlight cast a golden hue to the chemtrails that slowly fanned out and made interesting colors. I was moved to stand and watch along with my son. Those quiet, nondescript moments were what I enjoyed the most about being a father. Those seconds, where the world held still just long enough for us to hear the distant bird song, watch the winking lights on the silent aircraft as they glided overhead, and we just existed without the weight of any great care or obligation. That was all about to change. We tossed the ball some more, keeping our eyes on the sky. At one point, we could see 7 high-altitude flyers. When I could see over 11, a funny feeling began to crawl into the back of my head. The feeling got stronger when I saw 1 or 2 of the planes do things I had never seen before. I thought their kind always flew in a straight line. Some of them began to make sharp, erratic curves. Then, some of said aircraft got bigger, which means they were getting nearer, and something was wrong. There were flashes of light visible in the sky. We could have almost mistaken it for lightning had there been any clouds. Pops and bangs began to reach us, the kind that linger for a long time, as if echoing off the horizon in all directions. They were the sounds of war. One of the planes made a spiral with its chemtrail as it went into a tailspin. I instinctively ran for my son, even though the plane still had a lot of falling to do. Its trajectory changed just enough that it missed our yard, but not by much. It had passed by so closely that I could see inside the cockpit. The sound of the impact was deafening. That must have been the cue for all hell to break loose, because other planes spewing their plumes of ice and exhaust shimmered as they came within heart-stopping proximity of our small house, and debris and fire fell like rain. I told my son to go down into the basement with Mommy, who was in the doorway, nearly in hysterics. Me? I was rooted to the spot. I had to see how this would all unfold. One airplane glided so low that our trees touched its undercarriage, and its chemtrail exhaust burned my nostrils and stung my skin. It skidded across the empty field at the bottom of our hill, like a great stone skipping on a pond. The other aircraft became apparent, the kind that were actually meant for acrobatics, American fighter jets. They darted among the slower, larger aircraft like hornets bringing down pigeons. It was in that moment that a detail pierced my senses. The planes that were being shot down had no markings, no numbers, no decals, no nothing, as if they were ghosts. But that was enough for me. I ran inside as another explosion rattled our windows and shook the ground. I joined my wild-eyed wife and our children in the basement, though I suddenly doubted if the basement would provide sufficient shelter from a falling airplane. The minutes crawled by. The din of war faded away. I was still uncertain about the safety of coming upstairs, but I did. I stuck my head outside to see empty skies and smell the oil and burning metal and other harsh aromas of slain aircraft. "Honey, get the news on the television," I called back into the house. Bursts of light from gunfire and explosions bubbled on the horizon, telling me that whatever fight there was, it had moved past us. What had I just witnessed? Had some sort of terrorist attack just been thwarted? As the sky calmed, so had my fears, though I would find out very soon that my troubles had just begun. Stepping into the house felt like crossing a threshold between insanity and normalcy. Suddenly, in the domestic ambience of the house, where my wife and 2 sons gathered around the television, she looked at me with her great, dark eyes. "What's the news saying about all this, babe?" My wife wrinkled her nose when she saw me. "You smell like you've been dunked in ammonia or something." I was in such a heightened state that I had forgotten about the close encounter with the chemtrails from one of the doomed airplanes. "Yeah, I got sprayed by something. I'll shower in a second." "Is the news giving us anything at all?" "I can't find anything. There's no emergency broadcast or anything." Surely there had to be. Airplanes being shot down over American soil by our own fighter jets. There had to be something any minute. No news outfit worth their salt was going to just let a story opportunity like that just slide off the hook. Or were they? The sky was the last place I had seen anything about what had just happened. I slept uneasily that night. I kept grabbing my phone and looking to see if anything hit the news. The internet was eerily silent, reporting on everything else but the takedown of nondescript aircraft. I thought I would have been too short on sleep to get up with the alarm, but no. I made it just fine. There was that whole need to work for a living. I cursed myself for being a devoted father and husband, like I was. I'd even gotten up early enough to get out the door with a few extra minutes. I was sure the school wouldn't want to pay me any overtime, so I took the time to do a little patrol around the area and see if I could see anything. I remembered the crash in the cornfield that was visible from my own yard. Finding the wounded field had been a cinch. The landscape was bare like the surface of the moon. There was the earth, dug up and upset by the impact of the aircraft and the explosion, but there was no debris and no people, as if the plane that had been shot down evaporated, and nobody thought it worthwhile to regulate rubbernecking. I stood next to the field of blackened cornstalks for a long moment, leaning on the hood of my truck with the door open and the gentle sounds of Kenny Chesney drifting out. Nothing to see here. How convenient. I brushed off the conspiracy theory devil and went to work. Couldn't keep the school waiting. There were wastebaskets to empty from under teachers' desks and from student bathrooms, not to mention the mop work made for me from the kids just existing. The world, as I knew it, seemed to go on as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. It would take several days for it to manifest, the same way it takes autumn leaves a while to fall after turning colors. I hadn't noticed the extra child or 3 that were in the nurse's office. This had happened for a good 4 days in a row before I took notice. Their crying was on the level of a steam whistle. Their faces the color of ripe tomatoes. The volume of traffic to the school nurse never decreased after that. It increased, if anything. I would be pushing a broom across the old tiles and catch a glimpse of the nurse, always looking the same way. Bewildered. One day, I didn't see the school nurse at all. I saw one of the teachers wearing the hapless, helpless expression reserved for the nurse as she looked over the wall-to-wall mass of kids. Then, there weren't any kids, any teachers, or anyone else at the school, and the doors were locked up until further notice. The intense headaches became a town-wide problem, and the small hospital was overwhelmed in less than 3 days. Men, women, and children had such agony locked up in their skulls that the only way they could find relief was through heavy sedation, and there wasn't enough of that stuff to go around. I was out of work with the school locked up, so I was at home full-time with my wife, who couldn't stop screaming. She clawed at her scalp, pressed her palms against her ears, rocked from side to side on the bed, unable to reach some caliper, some vice, some piston deep inside her skull that would not relent. I don't know that I have ever felt so helpless than I did right then. My wife was right there in front of me, locked in a suffering that I couldn't comprehend, and I couldn't do anything for her. I had tried running to the dollar store for some over-the-counter headache relievers, but they were closed in the middle of their business hours. Everyone must have been home with a migraine. I peered in through the windows. Their shelves of meds stood with gaping spaces where all the Tylenol, Advil, aspirin, and similar used to be. I looked around at the landscape, pretty sure I could hear moans in the silence between breezes. My sighs rose in frozen clouds of mist. The air was getting colder by the day. There couldn't have been a worse time of year for things to go south like that. My chest tightened when I looked up at the radio tower. Someone was at the top right, next to the blaring red light that silently pulsed. Red alert, red alert, red alert. And did a swan dive onto the earth below. There was no way that was an accident. I drove over to the twisted body of a teenage boy and called 911. There was no answer. I could barely process anything. I ran in several short directions all around the body, waiting for the solution to enter my brain. There was nobody to get. There was nothing I could do. The boy gazed up with his eyes that were just as blue, just as clear as the sky that met his stare. I couldn't just leave him, but I couldn't do anything for him. My family needed me. I got home and did recon around the house, snatching up and hiding anything that I so much as suspected could be used as a tool for suicide. My wife started repeating over and over, "Kill me. Kill me. Just kill me. I can't stand it. Just kill me." She brought back the body of the boy into my memory, and he started to look more and more like her with each repetition. No sooner had I gotten home and shut the front door than it was drummed with frantic knocking. It was our neighbor, a kindly old gentleman named Frank that always had a greeting when we crossed paths. He was frantic, saying that his wife had lost consciousness and became unresponsive after days of crushing headache. He was trying to get through to emergency services, but nobody was answering the phone. They had to have been glutted with cases. I remembered the nurse's office being wall-to-wall with kids. That's how I picture the Hayrock Glen Clinic. I felt guilty telling Frank that I didn't know what to do. It was the truth, but it wasn't enough. He went inside his house, and we never saw him again. I brought a glass of water to my wife, who had somehow managed to fall asleep. I thought it would be cruel to wake her up. I leaned over her and felt a sinking feeling in my stomach. Her eyes were not completely closed. "Babe?" I prompted. She didn't answer. I gave her a gentle shake. Nothing. Then I gave her gentle slaps on the cheek, called her name with increasing volume. Her head lulled, but it was from my motions, not hers. She had a pulse and shallow breath. That was when time truly started to slow down for me. I kept the television on and tuned to the news. They weren't reporting anything pertinent at all. No mention of the airplanes or the pandemic of migraines that were causing people to pass out or commit suicide. I was just present enough to feed myself and the kids and put them to bed. The rest of me was poised to react to the slightest sign of stirring from my wife. For 3 days, she was out like that. For 3 days, nobody answered the phone at the hospital. 3 days before she would open her eyes and weakly call my name. I almost wished she had kept her eyes closed. Then, I wouldn't have to know just how much worse things were going to get. When things were finally a billowing dumpster fire of a nightmare, the news finally started reporting on what was happening. I guided my wife to the restroom. Her eyes ticked all over as if they would suddenly start seeing. Her one free hand, the one that wasn't holding my hand, trembled as it felt the wall, like the shaking antennae of a cockroach. I didn't want to see her eyes, and yet I couldn't stop looking at them. They were completely clouded over. Circles of gray, adrift in their seas of white. After she was done mourning over the loss of her vision, we got on with helping her whenever she needed to go. She stubbornly tried to remember a few key paths around the house. We spent a lot of time in front of the television together. The plump brunette woman prattled away as if everything had just been learned in the last hour.
The entire United States has gotten a headache, thanks to a pathogen that has researchers baffled as to its origins or its means of distribution. Seemingly overnight, businesses are shutting their doors, and hundreds of breadwinners are going to bed to sleep off a migraine that has broken all records of pain measurement. 9 out of 10 people that succumb to the pathogen and the ensuing migraines will develop complete and total blindness. The camera switched to an aging woman wearing a white lab coat and thin-rimmed glasses. The inflammation is so intense that the optic nerves are crushed. But there's other data that suggests that the ensuing fever also cooks the retina. So, it's a double tap, you could say, of making sure that the infected lose their sight. They cut back to the reporter. There are some that are apparently immune to the pathogen, but they are the exception, by far. There was a knock at the door. I was about to go all-out ballistic on whoever was on the other side of that door wanting something at the worst possible time. It was the neighbor from across the street, the one that couldn't see. But he was accompanied by someone that could see, an older Mexican gentleman, Rory Mendez. Calm, you in there? I pinched both of my temples and opened the door, looking into the blind eyes of Ollie Griffith. Calm. Rory is trying to sell me something, and I can't tell if he's being straight with me or not. Oh, for God's sake, Ollie, why not? Because I can't see! Well, what do you want me to do about it? Double-check the deal that he's given me. Make sure that he's given me what he says he is, and that he's making the payment we agreed to. I looked into Mr. Mendez's eyes and saw the frustration kindling there. As far as I knew, Rory was an honest man. The two of us that could see guided the one that couldn't back to his own property. Rory steered us toward a small pile of lumber, stacked next to a larger one. He wants to buy a fourth of a cord for $50. Now, I need you to make sure I'm giving him 50 and that he's getting a fourth. I gave Ollie a look that I knew he couldn't see. Part of me hoped that he could feel it. I went from being useless to being a critical component of a business deal that had nothing to do with me. I waited for some sign that his conscience might be getting heavy, but nothing. He stood, waiting like any other old man waiting on customer service to clear the runway for his takeoff. All right, Ollie, you indeed have $50 in your hand from Mr. Mendez, and his apportioned wood amounts to a fourth of a cord if I have ever seen a fourth. Okay, Ollie said, all the pleasantness gone, as if dismissing a genie now that his wish had been granted. Rory and I exchanged looks. How you holding up, Rory? I said with a knowing smirk. He shrugged. I might get some respect now that people can't see I'm Mexican. They both laughed. Our faces of amusement both burned out at the same pace, and the serious, sober glowering draped us. Think we can stay gainfully employed because of these? Rory said, pointing to his eyes. The work will be steady. I don't know about the pay. Rory flashed a grin of white teeth and nodded to the door. I'm not a stingy old shitcomb. You need me? I'm right over there. Well, I appreciate you. He nodded and excused himself. Winter crept in and wouldn't let up. It was like a bad scene from a movie where all the characters are in the trash compactor and the walls just keep closing in to crush them. The cold got colder. The dark skies got darker, and the tension in our little town grew. It didn't bring things to a grinding halt. People still bartered and traded what they could, and I was called upon frequently to oversee such transactions, often when I was in the middle of something. In exchange, I was usually fed, and so was my family. There were no generous smiles to go with these moments. They were matters of necessity, and people would have been glad to hold the lines of their own little bubbles and brandish their consciousness of caste and race and lineage and all else. But no. Now they needed each other, or else they might not survive to see or, well, experience spring. It took longer for these harsh realities to sink in with some people than others. Father Igor Corbett stood outside the church, hollering away for people to come in for service on Sundays, and well, any day he got desperate enough to play the part of the holy barker, calling for a special emergency service. I stood and watched him for a little while, the same way a child watches a wounded beetle struggle its way across a hot sidewalk. Children, God is still with you, with us, with Hayrock Glen. Now is the time to walk by faith, not by sight. Come and have your thirsty souls quenched with the good word. I can still show you the way to peace and relief. You can't see, asshole, someone said. Father Corbett's pale face flushed rose for a few seconds, a leftover reaction from when he was more in control of things. The blindness changed that. He went to his usual color, then went pale. Then, he began weeping pearly tears under his long, black coat. Nobody was going to come into the church and hand him their money anymore, at least not until they got some firewood or food to go with his sermons. It was almost a cruel joke, the way many people besides myself had snuck past him and were sitting in the sanctuary. We mostly sat with our heads bowed. There were probably 15 or 20. Nobody spoke to one another, partly so as not to alert Father Corbett that there were people enjoying God's presence, free of charge, and partly because many had no awareness of their neighbors, guided inside by a seeing companion. I dared to look around me 1 second too long, and I locked eyes with none other than Ron Simpson. He usually had nothing but smoldering hate for me in his eyes, but this time His gaze was gentler. Not quite gentle. Gentler. He came over and sat close so we could whisper without disturbing the over-eager priest outside. Calm. Good to see you have your sight. Good in most ways. Lots of people ask me to play broker for them. I don't know how they'll manage if I ever go back to work. What? Is the school locked up? You think teachers are going to shepherd a classroom blind? Most of them have a hard time doing it when their eyes are fine. He smirked. How is the family dealing with everything? I knew the question that was draped by those neutral words. He wanted to know how Elaine was, the one girl he almost married, until I came along and stole her heart. Ron was a man that played the field, and always would. I think that's one of the big reasons that she let him go. And he continued to play the field after she was gone. But the question mark that hung above the heads of everyone too born to do anything interesting with their lives was, what if he would have gone through with it and settled down for one girl? His family isn't friendly to me for this reason. I radiated more commitment than he did. The only person that's gotten the blindness is my wife. Both of my boys are just fine for some reason. This news physically jolted him. He raised his head to slowly look at all the panes of stained glass. Then, he got up and excused himself. I ruffled my eyebrows at him as he carefully exited the church. Sobs were beginning to shake Father Corbett's voice. Suddenly alone, I felt the need to chat with someone else. The plump figure of Bill Dalby was on the opposite side of me. The poor man was cursed with looking like Hitler, if the Fuhrer had eaten 3 square meals a day at McDonald's. He sensed my attention and looked at me with those light gray eyes of his. I almost thought he was blind until I saw his pupils. I scooched down to him. "What do you think, Bill?" I said. He grunted. "Well, I think the government owes us a goddamn explanation. That's what I think. Did you see any of those airplanes our boys were knocking out of the sky?" He answered before I could. "Blank. Spotless as cans of soup. They weren't warplanes. They were commercial. Now let me tell you, my brother over in Omaha watched half a dozen of those things fly over like they had the run of the place. And there's a base less than a mile away. You mean to tell me these things flew all over the U.S. and not one American pilot acted immediately? I don't like the smell of this one, son. That's got dirt of all kinds all over it." And just as Bill's words were about to make my eyes roll, he had me hanging on to every word, assuming everything he said was true. I glanced down at my phone and politely excused myself from Bill, who, as usual, hadn't even begun to get everything he had to say. I passed by the blind Father Corbett, who could no longer speak intelligibly. He just stood and sobbed with his arms outstretched. Wait, was he holding a collection plate this whole time? Really? Not that many would actually see him, I guess. The meek will inherit the earth, not the mewling, I said to myself. New Year's Eve came and went with utter silence. If anyone drank, they did it at home. I certainly had my share. But I had to be careful. Elaine would never see me sneaking drinks, but I didn't want to upset her radar. That wife radar that women have. It was the only secret I kept from my wife. Sorry, but sometimes a man's gotta do what a man's gotta do. Secrets. I wondered if Elaine kept any secrets from me. You get married, and then everything is open, including things that you thought would always be private. Somehow, the other person always ends up finding out. Somebody from your past calls for the first time in 12 years just as your spouse is the only person home. An email from a coworker is discovered that just happens to be perfect for taking out of context. Then it hit me. It's the dead of winter. Everyone is blind. I can go through my wife's phone. One of those things you think when you're hammered. Finding my wife's phone was a breeze. Doing so with muddied coordination was more challenging than I expected. But I got it without making much noise. All of her texts were from months ago. Most of them were from me. One thread was from someone with no name. Just a series of hearts for the first and last name fields. My inebriated brain triple-checked that it was a separate thread from my messages. She had been talking to someone behind my back, using eager, surreptitious words that someone like me was never supposed to discover. I eventually found a message where she called him by name. Ron. He must have found a way to get her attention again. I felt that moment coming on where I bask in the bitterness of the revelation and try to sort out what it was that caused her to seek out greener pastures. Before that could happen, I needed to check something else. I accessed her voicemail. There was one from Ron, dated from the Sunday that I had run into him at church. He was breaking up with her. He told her that he had no interest in caring for a blind woman, and their plans were off. It was terse and cold, just the way I had always figured him. I stood by the doorway to the boys' bedroom for a long while, reviewing mental footage of me and them and her, questioning just how good of a father I really was. If there was something a character like Ron could give them that I couldn't. Nah, he was the type that would set them up with TV dinners and candy and video games each time they would want attention. He couldn't be a father. So what did Elaine see in him that she didn't see in me? Maybe she didn't even think in terms of how her decisions would affect others. Maybe she was more like him than I ever realized. I decided to drink some more. I woke up to pounding on the front door. An officer was out the door who had clear blue eyes. Sorry to bother you, sir, but I've got an official letter for you, for your eyes only. I opened it with shaking hands, and I almost couldn't believe what I was seeing. The officer paraphrased the contents, as if he didn't think I could read. It's January 1st, so the local schools are all being turned into assistance and education centers for the visually impaired. You are being mandated by the federal government to serve as an instructor inside the institution and as a broker for business dealings outside. You and your family will never go hungry or cold again. He entered my kitchen and pulled out a chair and sat in it backwards. I looked at the letter, looked to him, gestured to it with one of my hands and shook my head. He smirked. I need your signature before I leave. Otherwise, I can't leave. I stared at the letter, not seeing the words. Then I saw my wedding ring on my trembling hand. I could have played the desperate, betrayed husband card and refused, just to see if they'd haul me off to prison so that my wife would get nothing. But that would mean the boys would get nothing. Nah, I couldn't do that. I wasn't Ron. When you say I do, you mean it. You commit to forever, no matter how long that ends up being. It was going to be a little longer for me than her from then on, but oh well, I had more to live for than just her. I signed the paper. We stepped out onto my porch and gazed off in the general direction of where the school buses were headed. They were filled to the brim, what with seeing drivers being a commodity. The meek shall inherit the earth, the man mused out loud. I shrugged my shoulders. I've met some really brash people without their eyesight. Well, they'll have to learn to be meek if they want to gain any independence. Right now, all those people needing your help have the system in a lockdown. We need you to help these people stand on their own 2 feet and see with their own 2 hands. I looked through the open window at my wife, who sat, rather symbolically, on the couch in front of the television as she watched the news. Perhaps the people I was going to help would see value in me that she didn't. I would let her hear Ron's message. Eventually.
It all started with me playing my horn most nights down at Vinny's in the village. It was just up the street from a couple of the bigger joints featuring the likes of Goodman, Basie, and Dorsey, you know. Those cats. And dames like Billy and Ella, showing them what for. It was an okay gig, I suppose, playing for drinks and tips and the hopes of meeting some of the classier acts in town. And maybe swinging a sit-down where I could maybe show them what I could do with the horn. Then I'd be right up there with the big boys and smooth sailing to a headliner. Maybe even become the next Harry James. Well, fellas gotta dream big, you know. Some nights there'd be big tips if the dolls were singing, enough to keep me in the 50-cent flop where I hung my hat, and maybe a few clams left over for reefer now and then. Ah, jeez, where's my manners? Name's Johnny Seckler, and no H in Johnny. Ma must have thought she was paying by the letter and figured she'd save a bit in the long run on the clipped moniker. I'm an ordinary Joe, I guess, who just happens to play the horn like old man Gabriel himself. I know it, and the tips show it. But I just never got that big break. Never ran with the right crowd, you could say. So there I was, staying afloat mostly, even if my aft end was taking on water. Now, before we go any further, I gotta tell you about Mr. Mike. See, Mr. Mike was the local tough guy, a big man in every sense of the word, over 6 feet and, well, Mr. Mike was a man of substantial proportion, if you just get my drift. Always wore a crisp white suit, spotless like it just came out of the cleaners, and a white fedora and spats. Where he ever found that getup is anybody's guess. Probably had it made up special over in Jersey someplace. He had his fingers in all the joints and even the small fry grocery stores. Now, I'm not saying he ran the big classy clubs. I heard tell those guys were all fixed up with the boys in Brooklyn, if yous know what I mean. No, Mr. Mike was a local boy born and bred, so they say, and some older guys even claim they remember him from school. But I'm not so sure. But now he was rich as Midas himself. Kept a mansion on 5th Avenue up in the 100 someplace with all the trimmings, and a big silver shadow and driver done up like Jeeves to sport him around, being seen and gathering up the take. He always had 2 guys with him lurking in his wake like junkyard dogs that didn't see 3 squares with any regularity. Needless to say, nobody was messing around with Mr. Mike. On the other hand, and it's always about the other hand, ain't it? Mr. Mike was the kind of guy who can make all a fella's dreams come true. Long as he played ball his way and did whatever little favors the big guy wanted done, just to show your gratitude. That's what he always said. It was just that, see? Johnny Seckler wanted no part of any of it. He'd make it his way, or he'd fail with the best of them and never owe nobody nothing. So things were going along as they do. The 3 Carmens were singing backup for us that one summer. 3 class dames, all named Carmen, or so that was the story. It was a good gimmick and made for a nice marquee out front. I never knew this for the longest time, but the girls were run by Mr. Mike. I never figured Vinny was in cahoots with the likes of him, but then if he puts the finger on you and you don't want to get torched some night, I guess you pretty much gotta play ball. I suppose I just turned a blind eye, didn't want to know nothing, until it was too damn late. My buddy Skitch, who beat the tubs at Vinny's, and I were gonna head up to Harlem this one night to catch his twin brother Ray on tenor sax at the Peacock Club. I was waiting at the bar, and the kid was taking his sweet time getting into his duds, and it was already late, so I went and pounded on the door. When I got no answer, I yelled for him, and yelled again, and then kicked the door in. There was Sketch on the floor, the needle still in his arm and a damned grin on his face. He was gone. Just like that, the kid was gone. I wanted to punch the little bastard in the mug real bad, but instead, all I could do was sit there on the floor and hold him, and bawl like a baby. Sketch had been like my kid brother, and now he was gone. The guys got me out of there and cleaned up and called the ambulance. They knew it was too late for Sketch, but you had to try. Then I made my way up to the Peacock in a haze and gave Ray the news. He staggered to a chair and fell into it, thanked me for coming and told me to beat it. He knew I wasn't to blame. I never touched that shit, but he had to make sense of things his own way. I kind of linked those two things as some kind of gateway to what was to come, finding out Vinny was glad handling Mr. Mike, and then the kid's death. So it was no real surprise when a couple of days after the funeral, Vinny called me down to the club a few hours early. I walked in, and there's Vinny and Mr. Mike laughing like old pals, half a dozen empties on the table between them. They called me over, I sat down, and just like that, Vinny leaves. I was still not thinking square from all that had happened, and maybe I only half understood the offer to move uptown a few blocks and start a real paying gig with Fatty Arquette and his band at Cafe Rula Lulu on Central Park West, a real swank address I'd never even seen the insides of before. Part of me must have said yes, because a week later, I was setting up at Lulu, watching the dames with the floor show fluttering around like cockatoos in their sequins and big feather fan-fans. Lulu was a swell joint, a great lit-up marquee out front, a real stage, and an orchestra pit with Lulu's written in fancy script on the front of our music stands. Sexy but respectable costumes for the girls, the whole bit. And a dance floor where 100 couples could mop up the dust with their twinkle toes. And as many tables with white tablecloths, the whole class act. You bet I was glad for the gig. I told myself, as you do of course, that it was just a job, a chance. That big break I knew I had coming to me one day, and that Johnny Seckler's ship had finally glided into port. I was there to play the horn and get paid and go home. That was it. No favors, no frills, nothing but the music. Yeah, I told myself that bedtime story like you do when you know somehow that you're climbing in the bed with the devil and he was gonna ride you hard till he was through with you before dumping you in an alley somewhere. But it started out okay. Lulu was a gas. She must have been a real looker in her day. And wasn't so bad now when she was pushing 50. She mamaed everybody, the girls, musicians, regulars, everybody. But she turned cold as an iceberg on 2 occasions. Whenever some old soak tried to get smart and started playing grab-ass with one of the girls in the show, and then on those rare but all too memorable times when Mr. Mike strolled in to take a look around and collect what Lulu owed him. I wondered how she'd gotten mixed up with the guy, knowing she was a real stand-up gal every day of the week and twice on Sundays. Whatever barrel Mr. Mike had Lulu over was a mean one, and none of her doing. Just like me. Yeah, and I'd walked in with my eyes wide open. As I say, everything was going along okay, I guess, and then this new dame showed up out of the blue, and Lulu said she was the new headliner. We all looked at each other, wondering what had happened to Lulu's sister Mandy, who had been there forever, singing second only to the big names when we could get them. All Lulu ever said was Mandy had gone back home to look after the mother. I never bought that yarn. Nobody did. I figured Mr. Mike had put the squeeze on her in favor of this new broad, and Lulu had to just put up. But then there was Dolores, that new singer and hoofer. One look at Dolores and I knew she was trouble, big time. But I was smitten the minute I laid eyes on her. Knocked off my feet, 6 feet under with no regrets. She had dark hair done up in waves and crimps on top of her head, and she was curvy in all the right places. She took one look at me and smiled, and I knew just where we was headed. Now, I was never one of those dreamboat kind of guys. I was shorter than some, but no jockey by a long shot. Okay in the mug, sandy blonde hair, and enough of it to cover everything that needed covering. And a goatee that some of the cats were sporting these days. And I liked what I saw in the mirror well enough. So I figured me and Dolores were a good match, and the rest was history. But what a history. See, although I couldn't take my eyes off her, I knew Dolores was off limits. Figured she was Mr. Mike's gal. Or at the very least, I'd be a sucker to mess with any of his people without a specific invite, and maybe even then. So I kept a real wide orbit between me and the girl while worshiping from afar. We had just finished the Christmas Eve show, the last matinee before putting the big holiday review to bed and closing for the week. Some of the kids from the show and I ran down to the village to kick up our heels and see what old Vinny was up to these days. I walk in, and right away I see Dolores and Mr. Mike at a table with a couple of other cats I'd seen around before. I ignored them and went and got us a table and ordered drinks, slapped Vinny on the back and said our happy holidays and all that. But then, of course, I'm spotted.
Hey, kid, get over here. What are you playing such a cold fish for? Say hi to Dolores and meet some friends of mine,
Mr. Mike bellowed, jerking his thumb towards an empty seat at his table. Just my bum luck. I'd been giving Mr. Mike the slip the whole time I'd been playing at Lulu's, but this was bound to happen sooner or later. I just hoped it'd be over quick and I could slip out of his mitts and get back to my pals and then amscray for greener pastures. Hey, how's it going, Dolores? I mumbled with a smile and a nod at the other two jokers. Names were hastily exchanged. Mr. Mike whispered something into Dolores' ear, and the next thing I know, she's in my arms and we're caught up in the tide of the dance floor. I shook my head. I hadn't even had a drink, but my head was kind of fuzzy. Maybe it was the nearness of the heat of the woman I'd been mooning over pressed against me, her eyes locked on mine. And what eyes they were. Green like I'd never seen, dark and fluid like deep seawater. I was snared like a fly in the web of those eyes and didn't care if this was my last minute on Earth.
Let's get out of here, Johnny. What do you say, huh? There's a little place I know that's quiet. We can talk. And they got absinthe for the regulars.
She cooed in my ear. We hopped in a cab headed uptown, and I felt her hand electric, soft, and warm, her fingers entwined in mine, and synced up like there was just one heartbeat between us. I was thinking that we should maybe skip the absinthe, cut through the chase, and head straight to her pad. I guess that's what happened, because we pulled up in front of a big high-rise address on 5th Avenue where I figured we were making for another party. But the doorman tipped his hat and said, "Good evening, miss." But I didn't catch the last name. We walked through a vast marble lobby that could probably hold 100 or more, then took the elevator for what seemed like an eternity. Dolores fished a key out of her purse and we were inside in no time. Off came the furs that landed in a heap on a plush round sofa. The high heels were tossed aside, and drinks were in hand from a nice bar set up in the corner. This your place?" I asked, taking it all in and whistling. The windows were floor to ceiling, and the marble floor was split level with a full grand piano on the riser. Manhattan lay out naked before us like a carpet made of stars.
Yeah, Johnny, you like it?
She purred as we started to slow dance to some crooner whose voice seemed to magically appear out of nowhere. "Do I?" I croaked. "It's first class. You live here alone?" I was wondering if some roommate, or worse, some husband might be lurking down the hall. Or maybe Mr. Mike might be the leaseholder on the joint.
Yeah, Johnny, the place belonged to my mother. She's gone, so it's all mine now. But enough of that. Let me show you the bedroom. I've been dying to show you my bedroom,
she said, grabbing a bottle and a couple of glasses from the bar. We slid into a bedroom that was straight out of one of those town and country magazines and was bigger than 5 of my own dump. I didn't have long to take in the sights before she pulled me onto the bed, and then everything went sideways. She was all over me, arms, legs, hot hungry lips, and I swear I melted into her and spread out all over the bed in a flood of limbs and kisses that took me places I never knew existed. I wondered if maybe she'd slip me a Mickey or something, but I wasn't in any condition to do anything about it if she had, so I just lay there, floating in the delight that was her flesh. It seemed to go on like that for hours and hours, the velvet kisses still clinging to me, pouring over me as I faded into the land of Nod, while a flood of images chilled my guts and crawled over my flesh, and I screamed like to wake the dead. I could tell we weren't alone anymore, and I tried to sit up. What the hell? I croaked. I wanted the hell out of there, but like I say, I was gone, and whatever was gonna happen that I should be worrying about probably already had. The last thing I heard was laughter, but nobody was having any fun. I came to with the sun burning a hole in my forehead, and I groaned, having no damn idea where I was. Then I remembered. I was still at Dolores's pad. Dolores! I bellowed, and then fell back into the pillows. Nobody answered, and then the wave of memories crawled back, and I jumped up and got dressed. There was a note on the nightstand. Hey, baby, we had quite a night. You were still asleep, so I went down to the club. I'll make good with everybody, don't you worry, though. Dolores will be back soon and take real good care of you. Yeah, right, I snarled. Whatever was up with this broad, it wasn't natural, and I wanted no damn part of it. I got a cab back to my digs, showered, and just fell back into some kind of stupor on the bed. When I came to, it was dark, 8 o'clock or so. Through the fog between my ears, I thought everything true. I had to go to the club, no two ways about that. I still had a job to do, bread to win, the rent to pay, even if I did want to put 1,000,000 miles between me and Dolores. When I got to the club, the band was tuning up without me. I got my horn and took my place, nobody acting the wiser. And then I spotted Dolores up at the bar, chatting up one of the regulars. She spotted me and I grimaced, but she ran up to me all hugs and kisses like nothing was up. I must have felt like a cold fish in her arms when I tried to slither away, but if she noticed, she never let on.
Hey, baby, I'm so glad you're here. I was worried about you, Johnny.
She cooed. Yeah, I'm all right, just a bit hungover. Let's get to work, I muttered, and she played along. But that was it. That was the end. I was quits with Dolores. Or so I thought. But then, when do we ever get off that easy, you know? It wasn't 3 days later, I swear, when one of the gals from the show came running up to me one afternoon before I even got my coat off, throwing her arms around me, hugging me, and giggling like a kid on her birthday.
Ain't it swell about Dolores, Johnny?
She beamed and gave me another smack on the cheek. What's up, doll? I asked, tossing my coat onto a chair.
Don't play dumb, Johnny. Everybody knows, and we all think it's just great. We didn't even know you two kids were an item.
Everybody knows what? I asked, truly dumbfounded. And we ain't.
Johnny, you're gonna be a daddy. Dolores told us. Ain't it grand?
She said, then peeled off me and disappeared backstage. I just sat there. No, not possible. I mean, we'd only been friendly that one time and, yeah, sure, it was a hell of a time, but I'm pretty sure things don't work that fast. I wondered what Dolores was up to and figured she was just looking for a daddy for some little junior she had already been percolating. Couldn't blame a gal. No, of course not. But I wasn't him, even if we'd ever got off the ground as any kind of pansy-wansy. But then Dolores shows up and it looks like she's about to pop. She's so big in the family way. It was then everything went haywire, and I thought maybe the old ticker was giving out. The room started spinning as if I was on a bender. If I hadn't already been sitting down, I'd have done a nosedive for the floor. Something wasn't right, and it was a whole lot more than Dolores turning up preggers. Then suddenly there was Mr. Mike beaming like a torch and hugging Dolores, kissing her on the forehead, and making all nice while the girls fluttered around like a bunch of hummingbirds. Dolores finally turned and looked at me and winked.
"Hey, baby,"
she cried, racing up to me and dragging me to my feet like I was a rag doll. All I could do was stand there, something like a grin plastered across my face, but sure as hell not feeling any of it inside. Dolores turns up ready to pop from one day to the next, and nobody says nothing.
"Hey, Johnny, you got a call!"
Hutch the bartender yelled, holding up the receiver. I was glad for the salvation and squeezed my way over to the phone. "Yeah, this is Johnny," I yelled into the phone. The guys had started warming up, and it was all I could do to hear whoever was calling.
"Johnny, it's Ray, Skitch's brother. You remember up at the Peacock?"
The voice rang wild with urgency through the line. "Hell yeah, hey Ray, how's it going? I was gonna..." But he cut me off.
"Can it, Johnny? You gotta listen to me. Get your hiney up there as soon as you finish up tonight. No ifs and ands, just do it. I should have said something before, but in the shock of losing Skitch, I sort of went crazy for a while. You gotta come, hear me, okay? Tonight. There's something you gotta know about Dolores."
He finished, and I could tell he was out of breath.
"I know I should have said something. I know. I'm real sorry, pal. Will you come?"
"Yeah, sure, Ray." Then the line went dead. Something about Dolores. Okay, I could beat a path up to the Peacock all right. The rest of the night was a blur, and then I was barreling along the 6 Express up to 125th and through the door and headed backstage when Ray grabbed me by the arm and dragged me back out into the street. He didn't say a word, and a few minutes later we were sitting in a booth in Big Daddy's, a hideous little dive in an alley near the Peacock that I wasn't even sure was legal. But what it lacked in other amenities, it was discreet. And you only got in if you was friends of Big Daddy, and they never watered the booze. "Okay, Ray, what gives?" I asked, slamming back a highball.
"Goddamn, Johnny. I don't know what I was thinking, you know, after Skitch's death and all,"
he began, shaking his head and looking around toward the ceiling. "Just spit it out, will ya? What about Dolores?" I demanded, but he just looked at me for too long.
"Okay. Back when Dolores and Skitch were kind of a hot item,
he started. Hey. What are you talking about? When was Skitch cozy with her?" "No, man. No. None of us ever met her before," I choked out, and it was his turn to cut me off.
"Johnny, shut up, man, and listen. You gotta hear me out. This is serious, man."
He tossed back his second jigger of old granddad and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. Okay, I said, trying to calm him down, knowing there must be some sort of mix-up.
"So sure, Skitch only went out with Dolores a short time, but Johnny, I knew that bird was trouble. But what could I do? My brother was a grown man. He had to keep his own business to himself like we all do. But when he came up here that one night saying he and Dolores was true, man, I breathed a sigh of relief. But I could tell, man, he was scared shitless. Ray wasn't afraid of nothing, and he was scared shitless. I smelled trouble all over that broad from the very start. He told me there was something not right with her, and we was going to check on it the next day. Said he had found some clinic where Dolores stashed her babies. Yeah, you heard that right. Seems Dolores was a regular baby mill. Though you'd never know to look at her. Kept them all stashed in some sort of home up in Poughkeepsie. That's where Skitch went the day before he killed himself. You and him were coming up here that night, and he was going to tell me what he found out, I guess. I guess he just couldn't hold out that long."
Ray muttered off and squeezed his eyes, and I knew he was trying to hide the waterworks.
That is if they didn't somehow put the hex on him and murder him,"
he added, wide-eyed and looking at me, waiting for me to say something. Okay, I got all that. But I'm telling you, Ray, I never met no Dolores that Sketch was making time with. All I remember was that Rican girl, Maria, and then Shelley for a while. And then the rest of the time he was just... Ray cut me off by shoving a picture across the table in front of me, then another, and then a third. They were all of me, Ray, Sketch, and some gal. Thing was, I'd never seen the girl before, never in a million years, and yet there we all were, grinning like kids in a booth at El Morocco, and a couple of us at the Peacock. Thing was, though, I'd never even been to El Morocco either, and I sure knew I never drank that much that I'd forget where I'd been. No, sir. So what's this? Who's the dame? I asked, but Ray just looked at me like I'd lost my marbles.
Who's the dame? Johnny, that's Dolores. You know, Mr. Mike's niece. The girl you've been running with.
His mouth was hanging almost as far as mine was. I just stared at the girl in the picture, a curvy little blonde in a tight satin dress. Ray, that ain't Dolores, I snorted, snapping the picture with the nail of my middle finger.
Knock off the shit, Johnny.
But this time I cut him off. This gal is white, Ray. My Dolores, or the Dolores I know, is smooth mocha, and a good head and a half taller than this broad. I'm telling you, man, I've never laid eyes on this girl. But how come we're all in the picture together?
You're finally wising up, ain't you, Johnny? I'm telling you something big is going on and it just ain't right. I'm telling you, she's got the juju on her. I can smell it. But Skitch, he wasn't born with the sense like I was, so by the time he caught on, it was too late. And that's why I had to tell you, Johnny.
But you're still not getting this thing square, Ray. That's not anybody I know. I felt like I was talking to an idiot. The two of us talking in two directions and never meeting in the middle.
That's what I'm saying. Things don't fit right in the world around Dolores or Mr. Mike either, in case you haven't noticed. The two of them look different to each person who sees them. And the thing is, nobody notices that either. Your Dolores is a spade chick, right?
And I nodded.
And so is Mr. Mike?
Yeah, I said, slowly getting up to speed and wishing to hell I could slam on the brakes.
Well, Skitch's Dolores was the girl you see in the picture, and Mr. Mike, he's like some plantation joker out of some bad movie. But he's a white man, I tell you, and some of the other girls have seen different people even than that, and nobody notices. So spit it out. What's with you and your Dolores?
Ray demanded. Well, not a whole lot. That is until just a few days ago. I took a shine to Dolores right away, but didn't want to brush shoulders with anybody hooked up with Mr. Mike. I never knew she was his niece, but the day before we shut the show for the holidays, I ran into him at Vinny's, and before I knew it, she and I were dusting up the floor. And there was me, thinking it was a dream come true. But then...
Yeah, Johnny, what then? Give it to me. I want to hear all of it.
So then we ended up at her place, real swank pad on 5th Avenue. Now what happened inside all night long was the usual fare, except that I started drifting off for a minute like some part of me didn't want to say what had really happened. Knowing I could never square it anyway, and if I did, he would just think I was loopy. Except that everything slid sideways, see? And I started hallucinating, it must have been. Some weird shit, but he cut me off.
That was no hallucinating. But go on.
I saw stuff out of nightmares, and it looked like some of them were wearing Dolores' face. And sometimes she was wearing their faces. And one thing I know for sure, we weren't alone. I thought maybe she had slipped me a Mickey, but it wasn't like that. I was clear, Ray. You gotta believe me. We'd been drinking, but, well, not that much. I passed out, woke up the next morning, she was gone. And I was glad because I knew I was through with her. But I still had to get to the club. She was there, acting like it was all business as usual. Then today, just 2 days later, all the girls in the show were buzzing around about her and me being in the family way, but you and me both know it don't happen that fast. It was just that one time, you know? No, sir, doesn't happen that fast. I thought she might have been trying to fix me up with somebody else's kid, but that didn't feel right either. I got a touch of the juju sense myself, and it was firing off like the 4th of July. So what do we know? What the hell do we do? I asked, glad somebody else was in it.
Well, I know Skitch went up to some clinic in Poughkeepsie, and whatever he saw up there made him kill himself. Or made somebody else kill him to keep his mouth shut. So what do you think we should do, Johnny, old man?
He stared at me, waiting for me to state the obvious. So I did. We head up to Poughkeepsie, of course. You know exactly where the place is? I asked.
As it just so happens, I do. Skitch described it to me. It's one of those rundown old mansions out in the woods with a long driveway. We can park somewhere and sneak in after dark. You got heat?
Course I do.
Then we're all set. For Skitch and for you, Johnny. Pulling your hiney out of the fire while you're still squirming.
We made our plans to head upstate the next day, and by all indications, it was gonna be war. Poughkeepsie. Ray showed up the next morning in some old wreck of a jalopy that looked like it'd never make it all the way to Poughkeepsie.
Have some faith,
Ray replied when I spoke my mind.
This is my Auntie Macy's car, and she keeps it in tip-top condition. It's just old. Now let's hit the road,
he said, banging his fist on the driver's side door, and all I could do was jump in. It was a good 3-hour drive up to Poughkeepsie and another half-hour of driving around back roads before we found what passed for a hospital hidden in the woods outside of town. The place was one of those crumbling old mansions that swells of New York society built in the end of the last century, cast with names like Carnegie, Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan, and that Ford fella, the one who'd built this rust bucket that carried our asses up here, knock on wood, in one piece. This time of year, there wasn't a leaf in sight except on the ground, and the whole place was a sea of naked trees, so we couldn't get that close before dark without somebody spotting us. We ditched the car and crept from tree to tree as close as we dared get. The place was a massive stone facade, 3 stories and a top floor. We took in the scene from where we were hiding low on the ground, and I glanced at Ray. You see anything funny about this place?
Hell no. I ain't laughing, and this joint gives me the whim-whams. What do you see?
Well, if this place was some kind of normal hospital, and I'm not saying it is by a long shot on an old nag, the ground floor looks okay. Lights on, all that business. But the top 2 floors are all boarded up, and there's something else.
What's that?
Where's the cars?
Yeah, you're right.
Folks like this have cars, and how would they get way out here anyway? We need to get a closer look. I took up a position on the side of the building near the front, Ray bringing up the rear and watching our backs.
What are we doing now, Johnny? How long are we gonna stay like this?
Ray's voice was hushed and he had to choke out what he was saying. I want to see who comes out of there and who goes in, I replied, never taking my eyes off the looming hulk. Ray just nodded, and I could tell he was getting more and more spooked by the minute, and I hoped to hell he didn't bolt. We had been there maybe an hour. Nobody came and went. Then I got a plan. Ray, make your way around back. I'm gonna lay a little diversion, buy you some time. Go look for easy ways to get in, a basement maybe, or see if we could shimmy up to the upper floors. Get a look at the attic, I said, already heading for the front door of the hospital. Well, lordy, ain't this place a peach? I exclaimed, barreling through the front door like I owned the place, looking around, nodding and whistling. This is a swank joint, all right, just like Cousin Frankie said it was.
Excuse me?
The woman in white at the front desk yelled in alarm as she jumped up and moved to give me the bum's rush, followed by a couple of burlies in white who I took to be orderlies.
You're not supposed to be in here.
They all barked at once. Oh, it's okay. Yeah, see, I'm looking for the best landing place for the missus, and this looks to be the place, I said, still gawking in wonder and playing the wide-eyed yokel. And don't you worry none, ma'am. I can pay. Yes, sir, you bet I can, I assured her, noting where the stairs were. It all looked to be in order, but that was about it. Nobody here but the woman and the 2 goons.
I'm sorry, we're not open to the public. This is a private hospital, by referral only. If your wife is in need of services, there are many other places for her. Or get your own doctor to refer you to us.
She panted out, clearly in a real state because I had just wandered in. Really, ma'am, my wife is soon to be in her way. Please, I said I can pay. Pay whatever you want. I'm a musician, see, with Fatty Arquette's outfit, and I get paid a pretty penny, don't you know? I kept babbling, grinning and looking around. The goon squad collided with me and shoved me towards the door. Please, this place would be just right for her laying in, I cried, my arms haymaking as they hoisted me in the air and flung me out the front door. "Where's your car, buddy?" one of them demanded.
"Oh, just my bum luck. She ran out of gas down on the main road,"
I said, still playing the dim bulb so they wouldn't get suspicious. All I hoped was that Ray had found something we could use to get inside this joint, 'cause one way or another, we were getting inside. I started meandering down the long driveway that led back to the highway, whistling and looking around like I was just taking in the sights in case anybody was watching to make sure I was headed back to the road. When I figured the coast was clear, I cut back into the woods towards the hospital, one tree at a time. It was past sundown and the lights on the ground floor were flickering out one by one, as if the place was shutting down. At least a part of it that covered as a front for whatever was really going on here. When I made my way around back, at first I didn't see Ray and was not of a mind to call out for him. I almost stumbled over his huddled form against the back wall. He grabbed me with his trembling hands like a hawk grabbing for its last meal. He pulled me down next to him and gasped out a few words.
No, not cut out for this, buddy. No, not me.
"Ray, what is it?" I whispered hard in his ear. "Get a hold of yourself, man. What did you see?" He was crying now, blinking back the tears and standing up, scrambling away from me like he didn't know who I was, but I pulled him back down. He was scared out of his mind like a kid about to get a licking. "What is it?" I demanded, gripping his arm and shaking him to his senses.
No, Johnny, no. Don't make me. You can't make me.
He winced, glancing up at the flank of boarded-up windows. I guessed he had made his way up there, shimmied the drain pipe or something, and gotten a good look at what was inside.
I can't do this, man. I'm sorry. It's not who I am. Not cut out for this.
He stammered, and then bolted out of my grasp and staggered into the night and disappeared. I hoped he'd make it back to the car and have the sense to wait for me, and that nobody heard him stumbling around. So I was on my own. Well then, that was just the way I liked it. I pulled myself up onto the nearest windowsill and grasped the drain pipe and hoisted myself up. This had been my specialty as a tyke, and I was glad I still had it in me. In no time I was up to the second floor. I jimmied one of the boards loose just enough to take a look-see, and saw it was a huge open space, the whole floor. Through the gloom I could just make out it was filled with equipment, old beds, all kinds of stuff that was probably left over from the former occupants. Onward and upward, hopefully to pay dirt that made this whole escapade worth it, and shed some light on the weird hijinks with Dolores, and maybe even Mr. Mike thrown in for kicks. He and the dame were thick as thieves, and no way I saw clear he wasn't involved. And it still gave me the shivs to think of that night. And now she turned up in a family way. No way that was possible from any of my doing. At the third floor, it was easier to jimmy loose one of the boards off a window. When my eyes got used to the pale light that filled the room, I got an eyeful and almost fell off my perch. Again, the floor was just one big wide open space, but unlike the junk and clutter of the second floor, this one was laid out in rows of what looked like large see-through glass bathtubs, full of greenish water like you'd see at the bottom of some swimming pool abandoned and long gone wild. The water was cloudy and there were things floating in it. Couldn't make out what it was though. But what was even crazier was there was a woman in each one of them, leaning against the slope back of the tub like they were asleep. Before long, a nurse came through, passing out little glasses of something to each one of them, and they tossed them off without a peep. Then they laid back and shut their eyes, all except one, who turned right at me and grinned. It was Dolores. Then she too just lay there soaking in whatever filled those tubs. That's when I noticed furtive movement in the green waters and figured Dolores moved her legs. But no, there was a frantic splashing around in the brackish stew that sloshed over the sides and clung to the tub's rim before dripping onto the floor in a gelatinous ooze. I gagged and almost turned away from the horrid scene, but quickly came to my senses when I saw something thrashing up against the side of the pool.
It looked me dead in the eyes, then disappeared back into the greenish muck. Taking a closer look at all the other glass tubs, there was the same splashing around movement through the waters. I gagged again and couldn't stop the bile from drooling from between my lips. And the smell, like seawater gone sour, and all of what should have been alive in it gone rotted. The thing's face was vile, a putrid grinning nightmare come to life. The same face I saw now in all the tubs, and the women smiling and paying no never mind like it was all the most normal thing in the world. But those faces, small bumpy foreheads, big pulsing mouths like a cross between a fish and a toad, and those eyes, oh sweet mother, those goddamned eyes, big lidless eyes that never blinked. It was all I could do not to scream. But the things in the tanks were getting real agitated now, and soon a couple of nurses came along with none other than Mr. Mike and took the things out of the tanks, wrapped them up in blankets, and then carried them away like they were nothing but a bunch of ordinary tykes just coming to this world, proud as can be. On the chance that Dolores had blown the whistle on me, I shimmied back down the drain pipe as fast as I could and disappeared deeper into the woods where I planned to hightail it back to the highway and retrieve the car where I hoped Ray was waiting for me. I'd seen enough to know this was some high juju that was outside my league. Then I heard a scream that came from the clinic, and I knew poor Ray hadn't made it back to the car. So I doubled back to see where he had got to and if I could break him out. The ground floor of the place was dark and locked up tight as a drum, so I got my ass back up to the second floor on that drain pipe that promised to collapse on me sooner than later, but I had to try. And there was Ray, trussed up on a table in some kind of operating room. And what they were doing to him, well, Ray was past needing any saving by me or anybody else. Those things from the tank were feeding on him like he was a bitch dog, and they were his pups, like leeches. Only what they were feeding on was a whole lot darker than any mother's milk. The sounds of the slurping and the chewing, the splashing and the plopping onto the floor when they couldn't take down any more made me spill the contents of my lunch down my trousers. Then I jumped back down to the ground and ran like hell. I didn't get too far before my conscience got the better of me, and I had to turn back. I knew Ray was a goner, but I had to see what they were planning on next now that it was clear that they knew somebody was onto them. I hid in the trees where I could watch the front of the place, and pretty soon a flank of cars with their headlights off pulled up, and everybody flooded out of the hospital. Nurses, what looked like a couple of doctors, the bruisers, and some women all piled into the idling cars and took off. There was a big old ambulance, too, where they loaded a bunch of bundles into the back of it that I knew were whatever they were calling babies. Then they all disappeared into the night, leaving just one car out front. And there he was. It was Mr. Mike, all right, tux and a top hat like he was about to parade through the doors of the Stork Club on New Year's Eve. He dragged some cans from around the side of the place and started tossing them through the windows of the old mansion. Then he disappeared inside for a few minutes. When he came out, he was running like the devil himself was on his ass. Then the windows of the top floor exploded, and a rain of broken glass and putrid water and slop came raining down, the slimy brackish ooze pouring over me. I had no time to worry about that, and I hoped that where I had hid the car wasn't where anybody could see it, especially Mr. Mike. He knew I was onto it, sure he did, but I was hoping his desire to make a getaway was stronger than his desire to settle any scores he had with the likes of me. I thought briefly about the few bundles the nurses had made away with, and how many more of those things were still flopping around in those tubs upstairs when the place blew. They had been abandoned, and I wasn't quite sure how I felt about it, but figured it was a good thing they didn't make it out alive. Then I thought about Dolores. Had she been in one of those cars? I thought about her bundle and decided I didn't want to ponder about it too much. Whatever's made it out of juju stays in juju, and I wasn't about to think of it as any kin of mine. That was 5 years ago now.
I never set foot back in New York after that, and have pretty much kept to the road. Some things, once you know them, there's no going back, not ever, and they sort of just set the stage for whatever comes after it. I hooked up with a couple of buddies of mine from back when I was a kid in New Orleans, guys who knew stuff outside the normal, that weird shit, and we sort of formed a cabal of sorts, and they're teaching me things. We traveled the back roads in the quiet little towns along the coast people have mostly forgot about, places all the new highways leave behind to grow dusty, places where nobody ever moves to from anywhere else. That's where you'll find them mostly. They hide at first, but stick around for a day or two and you'll start to see them. Of that you can be damn sure. They don't like to be seen when strangers come around, folks who've lost their way or can't find the road they're looking for. But then they'll come out eventually like nobody's business and big as life. They're easy to spot too. That mottled skin, those mouths just too damn big for their faces, lips always pulsing, and those eyes, those huge, lidless, unblinking goddamned eyes. That's the real giveaway for sure. That and the fact that they're always covered up head to toe in coats and hats, and even gloves on even the hottest summer days. Yeah, they're real easy to spot, and when we come across a nest of them, we put them down straight away, and then move on to the next. Do we get them all? Hell no, but they know we're on to them, and they're on their guard. As for Dolores and the other broads like her, and there has to be a lot of them who didn't look like anything out of the ordinary, I figured there was nothing we could do about them. As long as we took out as much of the spawn as we could, we figured we were doing the good work for somebody. We just followed the newspapers. Whenever we saw some young cat had committed suicide under strange circumstances, that's where we headed for, figuring that was as good a place as any to start looking. Most of the time, somewhere near there, some dusty little town or hamlet that looks like it hasn't seen a newspaper in better than 100 years, that's right where we usually find a nest of them. And then, well, we do whatever needs doing.
Chilling tales for dark nights.